Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Someone asking what happened to the Iron Brew. The Iron Brew is downstairs. Hello. So, hopefully everyone can hear me properly. And, well, if you can't, then I suspect I'm going to be finding out in the chat. Anyway, welcome to the Drydock. It's been a little while since we've done one of these live streams. Basically, because I think I tend to do them towards the end of a month normally, and then towards the end of September, obviously I was getting ready to go to Japan. In October, I was actually in Japan, and in November, I was in the States. And then when I got back, as you probably heard in the Patreon dry dock at the end of November, I was afflicted by many diseases, courtesy of my little daughter. So. Um, Yeah. So this is kind of the first time, I think, since the end of August that we've actually got a chance to do one of these things. So we do have questions. Obviously, as the title says, we've got just two Patreon dry docks we're taking the alternate history questions from. And then once we've gone through those questions, then if there's any super chats, I'll be going through them. And once we've run out of both of those, then we'll be going through the regular questions from chat. So, starting off with Todd Webb, he asks, since you touched on if the British did triple turrets in the dry dock in question, which generation of World War I naval race ship do you think would have been the best and the worst if the following applies? So say the Orion had been a British Teggett, Hoff or Gangot with 12 12-inch guns. If the Queen Elizabeth had had 12 13.5-inch guns, similar to the US standards, or if they did 12 15-inch guns instead. If they did 12 15-inch guns instead of going with 9 16-inch guns on the Nelsons or any other post-R battleship. Okay, the worst of those options is probably going to be the Orions being 12 by 12 12-inch gun ships. Not because, strictly speaking, having 12 12-inch guns is necessarily a bad thing, and certainly having them in 4 triples would be better than having them in 6 twins. But the reason I chose that one as the worst is because the British 12-inch 50, which is what it would have been equipped with, wasn't a particularly good gun. There were quite a few long barrel 12-inch guns around at that time. The British one wasn't one of the best by a fair margin, so that would automatically have made the Orions not particularly brilliant. The Queen Elizabeths with 12 13.5s, I mean, that's not bad. I mean, it doesn't give them the 15-inch 42, which is an absolutely brilliant gun, but it does give them something. The 13.5, especially if they're using the later generation 13.5 with the heavier shells, will be perfectly fine. But with that said, option 3, if they did a ship with 12 15-inch guns instead of the Nelsons with triple 16s. Now, this one is interesting, I think, because objectively, obviously, that's the heaviest armed, and that's probably going to be, therefore, the best. It's also the most future-proof. A 12 13.5-inch Queen Elizabeth would need an awful lot of upgrades to be properly competitive in World War II. I mean, okay, if you're going up against Italian ships with 12.6-inch guns, it's not, that's still fairly competitive. But if you're going up against enemy ships like the Littorios or the Bismarcks, potentially, obviously, the Queen Elizabeth's never faced off against the Bismarcks. But if they had done, 13.5-inch guns might have been stretching matters a little bit compared to 15-inch. And so while that version of the Queen Elizabeths would have been pretty good for World War I, they wouldn't have had the staying power, I think. Now, a Nelson with 12 15s, that would be very interesting, because that would mean the Royal Navy was standardized in caliber until fast battleships start to be developed, which might actually offer an even greater argumentation for keeping that standardization of caliber and going with the new 15-inch 45. My only question would be, how are they doing that? Because if they're doing 12-15s in 4 triples, that means a fairly conventional layout, so you're not going to get the weight savings that you get with the Nelsons. Conversely, if they did 12-15s and went, well, let's say if they did all 3 of these options, they went, well, we've had plenty of experience with triples, the French are trying quads, why don't we try quads as well, and gone with 3 quads, you could in theory get a Nelson style arrangement with 3 quad 15-inch guns. I'm not sure what the speed and protection would be on that at that point, because you would be talking about quite a hefty weight going into armament, but those would be incredibly powerful ships going into the Second World War, so overall those would be the best ones. FDXR asks, with all your modern knowledge and foresight, if you'd been transported back to 1900 and been given the unenviable job of being the head of the German Navy and tasked with creating a naval fleet that can defeat the British Grand Fleet in World War I, you have to deal with the same naval budget and dockyard building space that Germany had historically, and the British are going to obviously react. But with that in mind, what sort of strategy do you come up with, and what sort of warships would you help design and build for the German Navy in preparation for war? That's an interesting one. How would I... Starting in 1900... I mean, if I'm starting in 1900, then I would, because obviously I have future knowledge, I would downscale the construction of my pre-dreadnought fleet. So I'd maybe ask for them in pairs and put them... I think I'd ask for them in pairs and put the money more into cruisers, and also redo the German armoured cruisers, because some elements of German armoured cruiser design aren't bad, but there are a fair number of weak points. So if I if I revise the German armoured cruisers into almost proto-battle cruisers, I don't think I'd go as far as the Tsukuba and Ibuki that the Japanese were building, but I would speed them up somewhat and maybe give them an armament, kind of like looking at, if you look at the Scharnhorst with their 8.3-inch armament, I might either essentially build something like the Scharnhorsts earlier, or possibly even push, given that I'm saving money by not building as many battleships, push for a larger type of armoured cruiser that uses the 9.4-inch gun, or a development thereof, because then I would argue, it's about the same size as the 9.2s that the British are using on their armoured cruisers, but I would have it with, two twin turrets, one fore, one aft, and then, depending on the machinery layout, either go with a couple of single turrets on each side, give me a 6-gun broadside, or if I can squeeze it, maybe a Renown style layout, 2 twins forward, 1 twin aft, but it very much depends on propulsion. Obviously, I'd be pushing to develop the turbine engine sooner. And also, with the money I'm saving through not doing the as many battleships until the Dreadnought program comes along, I'd also be basically just expanding the general size of German ships, because that was one of their weaknesses in World War I. They had good torpedo boats, but they were torpedo boats verging on destroyers, as opposed to full-on destroyers, which is what the British had, and that didn't stand them in very good stead when they came up one-on-one. Likewise, a lot of their cruisers, their non-armoured cruisers, they tended to have 4.1-inch armament a lot of the time. They were coming out with some somewhat larger, more solid designs during the war, but obviously I need to accelerate that so that my cruiser line for my fleet screen is better off. So I'm strengthening, by expanding the size, all of the smaller ships at the expense of the pre-Dreadnought program. And then when the Dreadnought era comes along, hopefully I've been pushing for the adoption of turbines a little bit sooner. But even so, I'm probably going to aim to standardize on the 12-inch gun pretty quickly. Obviously, if I've got turbines, then I don't need to go for the silly hexagon layout. Definitely go for super firing turrets quite soon, because that might get me, the same 8-gun broadside, but kind of South Carolina style. Only using 4-gun turrets, which gives me more displacement to use for weight, because speed would pretty much try and match everybody else. And then I would look at escalating gun calibers on roughly a similar level as what the British are doing, just to keep the firepower up there. Because, of course, if you're designing ships to be, roughly speaking, proof against their own guns, then, well, having bigger guns is better. So, yeah, that would be kind of my trajectory. With the budgetary and construction limitations to hand, I can't outbuild the Royal Navy, but I can certainly put a considerably more formidable fleet on the field, especially if I can power through and get a bunch of ships constructed during the late 1900s, sort of the 1906 through 9 period, when the British government does a little bit of a wobble on whether or not it actually wants to be in an arms race. Clayton Bradish asks, say that each side decided to put all their eggs in one basket with one grand duel off the coast of Cuba, with that caveat, and the one that the Spanish Navy has proper ammunition and real, i.e. not not dummy guns on the Cristobal Colon, how could this have turned out, or would it still be the coming out party for the US Navy? Well, even assuming that all the Spanish ships in Cuba in the Spanish-American War have fully functional ammunition, fully functional guns, etc., etc., the simple fact of the matter is that the biggest ships that the Spanish have are armored cruisers with somewhat questionable design choices, shall we say? Whereas if you are looking at the Americans, they've got armored cruisers that have somewhat more sensible design choices going into them, and ultimately the US also has full-on battleships waiting. So in the event of a grand duel, assuming everything the Spanish have is actually working, they could do a reasonable amount of damage, because we are still talking about very close-range firefights. But the US Navy is going to, win that fight relatively convincingly. I'm just going to expand this. There we go. Right. Excalibur asks, an alternate question regarding Mers-el-Kébir. Oh, good, that's not going to be controversial at all, is it? So, he says, if the events at Mers-el-Kébir he says, the events at Mers-el-Kébir unfolded before America was officially involved in the war. And as stated in your video, the French were given the option by the British to sail to America. For this question, let's change the decision of the French admiral. He decides that upstate New York looks really lovely this time of year, and it beats swinging at anchor, so he orders his ships to head to America. Yep, plausible, very definitely. For the purposes of this question, let's assume other French commanders make a similar choice when the British give them the option. So there's a large swath of French ships suddenly in American ports all along the East Coast. We'll also assume that America flexes her industrial might and gets a few factories retooled to provide a small supply of spare parts for the French ships, thus keeping them in basic operational condition. America receives the French ships and immediately puts them to work in the Atlantic that was previously done by the American ships, so neutrality patrols, I guess. Since the American ships there are now surplus to demand for that theatre, the Americans send some of their own ships through the Panama Canal over to the west coast, since tensions are rising and they'd be needed there. So my question is there a plausible way forward from this premise or some close derivative where Japan decides there are just too many American ships off in the Pacific now, and the Pearl Harbor strike wouldn't be effective enough to attempt, and so they call it off? I'd imagine many of the newly arriving ships wouldn't be in Pearl because any given port can only service so many ships at once, so many of the new arrivals might be on the US West Coast. Well, there is a slight problem in all of this, in that if the if the French ships are still loyal to Vichy France and have interned themselves in the US, which, as I said, is a plausible interpretation if you want to be mildly creative with the orders that the various French admirals, especially Janson, had, because their orders, they did say if the fleet is threatened by a foreign force, one of your options is you can take it to a neutral area like the US. Now, obviously, in theory, those orders were generated with the idea of the hostile force being the Italians or the Germans, but they didn't specifically say in the event that the Germans or the Italians try to take your ships. It just says a hostile force. So you could use a very small amount of creative interpretation and say, well, at the moment, the British are being a hostile force. And, well, at that point, one of my options is go to the States. The British are saying go to the States. Okay, great. We have a resolution that doesn't involve everybody getting shot. So where I'm going with that is that if they are doing this because they're still loyal to the Vichy regime, they can't turn around and start doing neutrality patrols on behalf of the US. That would be a fairly major violation of the terms of the of the surrender of the French government. So, if we want to get to the end result of this question, which is the US sends more ships into the Pacific, what you could hypothesize is that without the Mers-el-Kébir incident, and with the majority of the Marine Nationale now in the States, then there isn't the bad blood that would be generated by the Mers-el-Kébir incident. We know both from Mers-el-Kébir and from Alexandria and various other places, the vast majority of the sailors, the regular rank and file in the Marine Nationale, were actually quite in favour of continuing the fight against the Germans. Basically, roughly speaking, well, it didn't hold true all the time, but roughly speaking, the higher rank you went up the Marine Nationale, the more loyal they were to the Vichy government rather than to the idea of continuing to fight. But if those ships are just, sitting at anchor, and as I said, there's no bad blood between them and the British, and they're watching Germany gradually, consolidate its hold, I think there's a chance that you might have either the French sailors' feelings spreading to the officers, and a lot of the lower ranking officers kind of were on board with the idea as well, or just the fact that they are now fairly isolated from mainland France and much more subject to British and potentially even American propaganda. You might end up then with a good chunk of the French fleet going, oh, you know what? We're going to join the Free French. And if they do join the Free French, who obviously were a thing at that point, then, yeah, you could see a good chunk of the Marine Nationale at the very least doing neutrality patrols, if not actively just flat out patrolling the Atlantic. Probably neutrality patrols because they are still at that point based in neutral ports, and that allows the Americans to send ships over. But as far as stopping Pearl Harbor, that's not really going to happen. If anything, the Japanese are going to try and amp things up, because Pearl Harbor isn't driven by a arbitrary number of American ships in the Pacific. It's driven by the fact that the US has embargoed their oil and they're running out of oil, and so they have to do something that's going to allow them to take oil, specifically the East Indies, before they run out. So Pearl Harbor is still going to happen, but what might change is that instead of putting a submarine cordon, which they then almost immediately dismantled for weird reasons, around Pearl Harbor and sending the mini subs in there, what they might do is put a handful of submarines vaguely near the entrance of Pearl Harbor, leave Pearl mostly to the carriers, and send their longest range submarines all the way over to the west coast, including the mini subs on their mother subs, and try and coordinate the Pearl Harbor strike either with mini sub attacks in San Diego and so forth, or just wait, because presumably the American ships will scramble out once Pearl Harbor gets attacked, and then you try and torpedo them off the west coast. So Yeah, if anything, it's going to make the Japanese escalate their preparations for Pearl Harbor, not back off. Um, yeah, unfortunately, because of that fact of the Japanese need to take the Dutch East Indies, that is going to mean war with America. Therefore, they need to start war with America on the strongest possible footing. The Japanese pretty much at that point have to, in their mind, attack. And whatever arbitrary number of ships there are, some Japanese sailors and officers might even answer the better, because it means they can take out a bigger chunk of the American fleet. Physical removal enthusiast asks, what would have happened if, instead of sending Goeben and Breslau to the Mediterranean, the Kaiserliche Marine sends them to Graf Spee over in the Pacific? What would the British response be, and would Spee have had a chance of breaking through the home fleet blockade, assuming that the Battle of the Falklands either doesn't happen or is a draw? Ooh, that's okay. So Breslau's a pretty decent light cruiser, but is still a light cruiser. Fundamentally, for something like the Battle of the Falkland Islands, that doesn't change the equation that much. Goeben is the big one. Now, this could go to one of two ways. It could mean that Spee would have less chance of getting through the home fleet blockade, because if they dispatched Goeben when they did, one of the issues that Goeben had was her machinery was in need of a bit of an overhaul by 1914. So if she's been sent at that point, that when she was dispatched to the Med, except she's gone to the Pacific, then her machinery is not going to be in the best of states, and hauling all the way across the Pacific, round the South America, etc., she'd actually potentially, apart from her firepower, she might actually be more of a liability, but then slow the force down. Plus, if there is a German battle cruiser in the Pacific, then the British are probably going to send New Zealand to be in the area, as well as Australia, so that they've got at least 2 battle cruisers. And you've got to remember as well, the Japanese have their first battle cruiser, the first of the Congos, are there as well. So I think the because of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the Royal Australian Navy, Royal Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy might actually make a much more concerted effort to monitor and bring von Spee's squadron to battle in the Western Pacific, rather than sort of go, oh, they've escaped, that's annoying, because of the much greater threat. But if we assume that Goben's sailing is delayed by 6 months to a year, so her machinery is in a pretty good state, I think at that point, given the value of Goeben, potentially also with the 2 Scharnhorsts to the high seas fleet, I think that von Spee probably would try and avoid the Falklands, especially if he's won Coronel, which that would definitely happen in this scenario. So I think at that point he would just be thinking, look, I've got a good chunk of what could be a very useful addition to First Scouting Group. I need to get them home. I can't afford diversions. If he sends anything to the Falklands, he might dispatch a few of his lighter ships, maybe led by Breslau, to go and take some pot shots. But the main cruisers force of the Scharnhorst and Goeben would keep on motoring. Now, would that get him through the home fleet blockade? I think it's a bit of a coin toss, because in theory, assuming that they can bounce up the Atlantic collecting coal to keep their engines running, in theory, a force that is at minimum Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Goeben is strong enough to punch through the patrols that the British have on blockade duty. But if the British know Goeben is out there, if they don't pull off some kind of interception maneuver, because we know Princess Royal was sent to the Panama Canal, but maybe Princess Royal goes with 2 Invincibles instead, or something like that. But assuming that the British don't try and intercept them in mid-ocean, if they know they're coming, they will have stronger patrols, and probably more in-depth patrols, waiting for them. And then, as I say, it's a bit of a coin toss of, can they sneak past? Because if they get spotted, then they're going to meet overwhelming force, and that's going to be pretty much it. If they aren't spotted through perhaps some clever maneuvering by von Spee, and they transit the main blockade area at night, perhaps, to reduce visibility and don't run into any minefields, there's an outside chance they might make it. Graham William Kidd asks, so this is the continuing Frankenship Odyssey. So he asks, right, so we're combining the best of breed components, machinery, armor, armament, etc., etc. So the Frankenship task this time is to create the best Franken aircraft carrier for somewhere between 1930 and 1945. So do you armor it or not? He's even included a little Hamlet alike. To armor or not to armor? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the deck to suffer the bombs and rockets of outrageous fortune, or to armor against a sea of troubles. Okay, so Franken aircraft carrier. Okay, for this, I'm going to throw together... Okay. You see, I think there's two ways of going about this. Because once war starts, you're free of the treaty restrictions. So in theory, you could go as big as you like, which, you get to the midways, and obviously that kind of happens. But for something that will actually be useful during the war, i.e. something you're going to have to start building before the war so it can be commissioned at a useful point either before or shortly after World War II starts, I think your sweet spot is probably to aim for the period between the First and Second London Naval Treaties. So when carrier tonnage is still 27,000 tons max. And at that point, you're going to want to do a hybridization of British and American carrier design. Because if we're talking about the early 30s, the Japanese at that point are designing, well, they're designing a variety of things, but the main thing they're designing at that point is Hiryu and Soryu, which, nice as they are, they're pretty small in terms of fleet carriers. We're not talking the Shikakus yet because the Shikakus haven't been designed, and I forgot to put my phone on mute. Right, there we go. Okay. So, where were we? Oh, yeah, Franken aircraft carrier. So I'm going to combine British and American design philosophies. So we're going to go 27,000 tons, which is treaty max for carriers. And what we're going to do is we are going to hybridize Ark Royal and the American study that was done in the build-up to eventually choosing the Yorktown class, which was there was a very large treaty max carrier that had an armored flight deck and a full-sized air group. So what I would be doing is taking the obviously more British themed approach of having an armored flight deck, although as we said the Americans did consider this as well, but the American approach of an open hangar. We're going to then minimize down side armor to maybe inch and a half, basically splinter proofing and destroyer shell proofing. So we're going to eliminate any real chance of resisting cruiser grade gunfire, which is going to cause a bit of pushback amongst some people, but we could plausibly pull it off. And so we've got open flight deck, open hangar. We're going to go big American style hangar. It's very tempting to go double hangar like Ark Royal, but I think with that extra weight up top with the armored flight deck, for stability reasons, it's probably better to go for a nice tall single hangar that goes end to end. With the armor up top, we're going to take the British approach to anti-aircraft installations because, believe it or not, Ark Royal in her 1930s format was considerably more heavily armed anti-aircraft wise than a Yorktown was. Speed-wise, we'll take the American approach of going a little bit faster, and hopefully by ditching all of the anti-cruiser armor on the side, plus obviously not having an armored box hangar the way the British had, with basically putting all our armor eggs into just, as I said, splinter plating and then the armored flight deck, hopefully we then also have enough weight to have at least a modicum of a torpedo defense system. So at that point, we would have a 27,000-ton armored flight deck open hangar carrier doing at least 33 knots with a heavy anti-aircraft installation. Not much of a chance of winning a surface gunfight if people are actually shooting back at us, but if we are in that situation, it's already gone horribly wrong anyway. And we have some torpedo defense just in case we do get torpedoed. And our air group is probably going to be in the region of around 90 aircraft. So that would be a pretty fearsome carrier to take into the Second World War, because basically, unless your name is Glorious, you don't have to worry about being shot at by surface vessels, and you've got a really good anti-aircraft armament to build on, and you're going to be resisting incoming bombs quite well. So, yeah, it's all good at that point. Chipster8253 asks, I know that in the late 1930s, radar was in its infancy, with the massive chain-home radar stations being, well, massive. There were, however, shipboard installations, which clearly brought the size and weight down to manageable proportions and dimensions. Given that, would it have been possible to mount a large rotating antenna and all of the other hardware for surface search radar to a rigid or non-rigid airship, or just a big balloon? Theoretically, yes. I mean, one of the main differences between chain home and chain home low compared to shipboard radar, certainly at the time that chain home is being installed, is, of course, coverage. Chain home can see a lot further with a lot more detail, in part because it's bigger and is putting insane amounts of power into the systems compared to what you can get on a ship. And yes, airborne radar could be mounted on airships. It was occasionally done. K-class blimps, some of them had air-to-surface radar. It's not as easy as you might think, because although the airships certainly have the lift capability to haul the radar around, there is obviously a lot of metal structure in there that you have to account for. So, the alternate history part of the question, assuming the British shared their cavity magnetron radar tech with the US and the Royal Navy decided to install blimp or balloon-mounted radars. Oh, I see. Okay, that's fun. Right, so instead of putting air-to-surface radar, they're basically taking a somewhat miniaturized version of the chain home stations, sticking them on blimps, and then tethering them at Long Island, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Bermuda, Iceland, and the southern tip of Greenland, Bahamas Island itself as opposed to Iceland. And because they're tethered, you put a massive, great power cable up there to run this gigantic radar. They're sitting up at 8,000 feet, thus giving basic surface search radar a very, very long range and communications. What would this have done for the Allies as it applies to the Battle of the Atlantic? Would it be a game changer of the first order, or would there still be a mid-Atlantic air gap that would need to be closed by the long-range air group? Well, so essentially we're making a gigantic air-to-surface radar and sticking it on all the Allied controlled coasts. That would be incredibly helpful. It would certainly make tracking German raiders as they're emerging from the North Sea considerably easier, and it would ruin U-boats days because, for example, when the U-boats rock up off the US East Coast, if everyone goes, ha 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 ha, I have many radar eyes of Sauron, I can see everything, then the minute a U-boat surfaces, you're going to have patrol aircraft being sent out to go and poke at them. So it would certainly help. Of course, they're not going to have... Well, they're not going to have the range to reach out into the mid-Atlantic, so there is still going to be a dead zone where U-boats will probably actually congregate even sooner. But also, you're going to have to probably transmit, or probably by cable, all that information down to the ground, because there's no way a team in a blimp is going to be able to sort through all the radar returns you'd get from mounting these gigantic radars and scanning hundreds or thousands of square miles of the ocean surface. But in terms of giving you a clear path through up the US East Coast and along a good chunk of the northern part of the Atlantic, it would allow Allied assets to be concentrated in areas where the U-boats basically at that point have to run to, which would make hunting them down somewhat easier, simply because, well, they're mostly in one place rather than being spread out everywhere. Sapper Ninja. Just copying down the super chats. Sapper Ninja asks, on January 31st, 1939, the US and the UK are each gifted a magical final countdown machine. This machine can be configured exactly one time for one piece of technology from 2024. Due to magic, the US Navy and Royal Navy will retain full usability of the technology in question, but will not be able to take it apart to study it or learn anything else from it. The machine works by placing all the required raw materials into its in-tray, and it then takes the same amount of time to produce the item as the item takes to build in 2024. This effect stacks, so if you put in 10 times the amount of raw materials, it will start producing 10 items. And he's actually limited what I can give them. Which of the following would have the greatest impact, and which do you believe the US Navy would pick? Okay, so our list is the Phalanx and Goalkeeper CIWS systems, the Otto Malera 76mm Super Rapid deck gun, the 5-inch 62 Mark 45 and the 4.5-inch -55 Mark 8, the AIM 9 Sidewinder, the Mark 48 Seabass and the Spearfish Torpedo, and the AN-Spy 1D and Samson radars. Okay. So I'm going to rule out the radar systems because, I mean, if you want to be kind of, nasty genie, you could say, okay, well, you get the radar, but you don't get the computer systems to, process and display all that data. But even assuming that that is an integral part of, the thing, at that point you have a really, really good way of seeing where people are, but actually then doing anything about it is still down to all your regular World War II offensive systems. Now, while it would be obviously a hugely powerful thing, there are better options, I think. The AIM-9X Sidewinder, I'm going to say no to, mostly because, again, you need a lot of ancillary systems to make it work. And given the sheer number of World War II aircraft, even if you could kind of jury-rig a way of making it work, yeah, it's good, but I think, again, there are more effective things on this list, especially given the production rate of these systems. The torpedoes are very tempting because if you think about all the torpedoes that either were successfully launched at but didn't hit, or hit and only damaged, or where submarines saw a target but with the torpedoes they had at the time they couldn't engage, if you give them modern torpedoes, I mean, you calculate the firing solution, you put them in the general area, they activate their seekers, they do their massive underkeel detonations. There's not really a huge amount in World War II that's going to live through that. Yes, you would have to modify the launch tubes to actually accept them, but given the utility, yeah, I can see that definitely being a front runner. The Otto Malera 76 Super Rapid, much as it's tempting, the fact is you've got the 5-inch 62 and the 4.5-inch 55 there, so it's essentially, okay, yeah, you could put it on more ships because it's smaller, but you might as well take the bigger one. Phalanx and Goalkeeper would be quite tempting because those, as far as I'm aware, at least can be made in standalone. So you could literally just be manufacturing them and going, everybody gets automatic radar tracking CIWS, which would cause absolute havoc with incoming enemy aircraft. But you can probably do the same with those deck guns as well. You know, they're going to be much longer range, much more accurate. Although they don't have their own built-in radar, so you'd have a very, very rapid-firing, very long-range destroyer-small cruiser-grade gun. But without the radar, you're still working on World War II-era fire control, because I was thinking for a minute they'd be really good as long-range anti-air. But yeah, you've still got World War II fire control to work with. So, okay, at that point, I think it's a coin toss between the Phalanx and Goalkeeper and the modern torpedoes. The modern torpedoes are obviously a much more offensive weapon. Even if you're only making relatively small numbers of them, you can have submarines with, tell them to keep one in one tube, and they have all the rest loaded out for their regular operations. But the minute they see anything particularly interesting, like an enemy capital ship or a really valuable large freighter, you're pretty much one shot, one guaranteed kill with those things. That would change the course of naval conflicts colossally. With kind of the either-or option being a standalone Phalanx or Goalkeeper, probably Phalanx because the ammunition's easier to manufacture. Because, yeah, there's not a huge amount that's going to survive if, I mean, yes, its Phalanx installations are quite heavy, but to be perfectly honest, given their effectiveness relative to the effectiveness of other weapons, even if you were, let's say, if you're looking at a Nelson class, even if you're replacing the 4.7-inch single guns, each with a Phalanx, 4 Phalanxes on the back of a Nelson, ain't no Italian air or German aircraft getting close to that thing. So yeah, I guess it depends. Do you want to preserve a ton of your ships that are sunk by aircraft, or do you want to blow up a bunch of enemy ships that you didn't historically get to blow up, or blow them up a lot earlier? And that would be your difference in choice. It would be quite funny though to see, like, something like PQ-17 and the Luftwaffe coming in, and then it turns out that every merchant ship and escort has at least one Phalanx on it. Mike Lima asks, what if instead of the Admiral class, the British began to build 28 to 30 knot F3 type battle cruisers? How might they impact the Washington Naval Treaty? Would only the alternate timeline hood be kept, or would all 4 F3s be kept and older battleships sacrificed instead? And would they still make Nelson or Rodney as is, or an F3 derivative with fewer 16-inch guns? And how might these changes impact World War II? Okay, so if you've got 4 F3s, the British historically, pending the arrival of Nelson and Rodney, kept the World War I King George V's and the Iron Dukes. And the understanding was that when Nelson and Rodney arrived, they ditched the King George V's, and the Iron Dukes went away, and Tiger as well, went away towards the end of the 20s. If you've got Hood, Renown, Repulse, etc. But you've also got 4 F3s. I don't think the British are getting Nelson and Rodney. They might want them, but if you've got Hood and 4 F3s floating around, I think the Japanese are going to go, well, if we're only getting Nagato and Mutsu, and you've already got 5 similar displacement ships, no, we're not letting that. We're not letting you have that. And the Americans similarly will probably go, well, yeah, we've got 3 Colorados, but you've got 5 35+ thousand ton ships. You ain't getting any more. So yeah, Nelson and Rodney at this stage would be F3s, not the 16-inch ships that we all know and love. Well, some people love them. So yeah, so I think that would be, instead of having that clause in the Washington Treaty where it says, oh, and the British get to build 2 more ships, they wouldn't have that option. The King George V would have to go immediately, and probably most of the Iron Dukes, if not all. I mean, just thinking of tonnage-wise, you wouldn't have to get rid of all of the King George V and all the Iron Dukes to make up the tonnage of the 4 F3s. You could probably keep 1 or 2, but then why would you want to at that stage? Let me just pull up the text of the Washington Treaty. I'm just going to check some tonnages. I think they'd still keep Tiger, at least for a bit. There we go. Right. Right, so historically speaking, the British are keeping 580,000 tons. The Iron Dukes are rated at 25,000 each. So let's break out our calculator. Right, so we've got 4 ships at 23,000 tons. Okay, Thunderer for some bizarre reasons listed as 22,500, but whatever. We're gonna throw them a bone and say it's 23,000 as well. So for the 13.5-inch ships, we have 192,000 tons of 13.5-inch ships. Now, if we have the 4 F3s, they add up to 140,000 tons, which means we have 52,000 tons left for the British, which would mean they could temporarily retain, well, obviously that's not counting for Tiger, so they can keep Tiger, and they can retain 2 of the Iron Dukes, but that's not a really useful unit. 52,000 tons. What can we do with 52,000 tons? See, the problem is, if they are, the British could potentially argue, okay, we're not going to get any 16-inch gunships, but maybe we can get some more 15 inches to round out our tonnage. The problem is, one more 35,000 tonner, and you've only got 17,000 tons left, which isn't enough to do, much of anything, to be perfectly honest. Oh, but if you get rid of Tiger, that gives you 45,500 tons on top of your one-off 35,000 tonner, which would then leave you with only only about 10,000 tons spare. I mean, the other thing is, technically by their official weight ratings, you could actually get, if you ditched all the 13.5-inch ships, you could technically get another couple of Renowns, which might appeal to the British sensibilities a bit, because then you have 5 Revengers, 5 Queen Elizabeths, 4 F3s, 4 Renowns, and Hood. So that give you, 5 squadrons of 5 plus 4. But we know that they're also aiming at reductions. So, yeah. And they are having to reduce somewhat anyway. So, yeah, I think the British would probably have to settle for keeping the 4 F3s plus Hood, maybe building one more, if they can fit it into their weight restrictions, because there won't be much point in them building one 16-inch ship. And the choice of the 16-inch gun was more of a prestige thing than absolutely we must have a 16-inch gun for tactical reasons. The main reason they wanted the 16-inch gun was, apart from everyone else had got one, was more the fact that the 16-inch gun was seen as representative of what the latest and greatest was. And of course, at that point, apart from the one-off Hood, the latest and greatest that they had in class numbers was the Queen Elizabeths. So what the British were saying was essentially, we want to build a couple of modern battleships to go, to sort of match the Nagatos and the Colorados. If they built F3s, then, well, they have those. So they don't need to worry quite as much. So yeah, I think they just end up ditching the 13.5s and maybe getting a 5th F3 out of it. Marlin Stout asks, and this is our halfway point on the Patreon questions, in case you're wondering. Marlin Stout asks, suppose the Kriegsmarine sent one of the Scharnhorst to lead the attack on Oslo instead of Blucher. Presuming that it was loaded with troops and munitions the same way that Blucher was, what would the result of Oscarborg's fortress attack have likely been against Scharnhorst, assuming the ship was hit in the same place that Blucher was hit? What are the odds of Scharnhorst being crippled or sunk by this damage? So, theoretically, the actual warhead of those torpedoes is not that great. So the damage, in theory, Blucher should have been okay. So in theory, the Scharnhorst would be okay. But one of the big problems for both ships, and obviously historically it was for the Blucher, would be they've got all these troops on board, and when Blucher is hit, as well as obviously the 11-inch shell hits, but when Blucher is hit, a whole bunch of stuff that the army troops have on board catches on fire, which really, really doesn't help matters. So I think this could go one of two ways. Either Scharnhorst gets hit by a barrage of relatively low-yield ancient torpedoes, is damaged, but can continue on into Oslo and will obviously capture Oslo somewhat sooner than historically. Or Scharnhorst is hit by the torpedoes, is damaged, and then, similar to Blucher, it sets off a bunch of stuff that the army is storing up top, except that Scharnhorst being Scharnhorst and therefore much larger than Blucher, there's a lot more stuff stored up top, so the fire is even more crippling, and thus, even if the damage below the waterline is somewhat less severe than it was for Blucher, then, well, if the fires are far much worse, thus impeding damage control, you could end up with actually the same thing as Blucher. A lot of it would depend on exactly how much flammable and explodable stuff the army has on Scharnhorst and how much of that then kicks off. Knight 6831 saying the Admiral Hippoclass never stood a chance as her armour was inadequate against the fortress gun shell penetrating strength. That wasn't really so much the problem, though. The 11-inch shells messed up her upper works, but if it had just been the 11-inch shells, Blucher could have limped on into Oslo. It was more, the water getting in the bottom because of the torpedoes and the fires caused by the torpedo explosions that really did for her. Miko Leitner asks, in an alternate world where World War I ends via a treaty in late 1917 and where Germany gets Alsace-Lorraine and some colonies, retreats to its borders elsewhere in the west, and later does the Brest-Litovsk, whatever, treaty in the east, the one that ends the war with Russia, what does the naval landscape of the 20s and 30s look like? So we're basically saying that Germany gets a qualified win somehow. So basically it's retaining its fleet. I think a lot is going to depend on how Germany then sort of resets itself. Because one problem that Germany is going to have is that come 1917, they've got Baden and Bayern, but as far as what you could consider current generation warships, that's it. I mean, the Kaisers and the Königs are all right, but they're still 12-inch gun ships, and the existence of 15-inch gun ships really puts some big questions over them, which basically means that the vast majority of the High Seas fleet is now, technically speaking, at least partially obsolete, whereas the British have 5 QEs and 5 R-class versus the 2 and I suppose Nelson, Renown and Repulse, and Hood on the stocks. The Germans do have obviously some, the Mackensons and the Ersatz Yorks on the stocks, which could help redress the battlecruiser balance at least. But the Germans are going to be looking long and hard at a major problem, which is either in the next half decade or so, you're going to have to scrap the vast majority of the High Seas fleet and essentially rebuild it from scratch at a point where the British, in terms of hulls already in the water, have a 13-2 advantage, and that's only going to get worse. Or you acknowledge that maybe this was a terrible idea in the first place and focus more on ground troops, because ultimately at that point, in theory, the German army has done quite well for itself, and the Navy not quite so much. I think realistically, the Kaiser might get told, we can't afford to rebuild but basically the entirety of the High Seas fleet from a massive disadvantage in numbers. So I can actually see the High Seas fleet actually becoming more of a battlecruiser based navy. So they might complete Sachsen and Württemberg and maybe one other squadron. So they'd have 2 squadrons of 4 battleships, basically. So they can say, hey, look, we've got the British have got the Queen Elizabeth and the R's. We've got 2 squadrons. Never mind the fact we've got 1 less in each squadron. And obviously the British could be building more. But they might go, okay, here are 8 battleships. These are our kind of home defense fleet. And now that we have a bunch of more colonies and we're not trying to directly compete with the Royal Navy, then we want fast, long-range, impressive ships to guard our colonies. Again, we saw what happened with von Spee's squadron, at which point the Der Flingers which will probably be the smallest ships then in the high seas fleet that are kept long term, and then the Mackensons and the Ersatz Yorks as they come online will probably be the main strength of the high seas fleet. They'll be wandering around, showing the flag and being all impressive and fast, which in turn will probably force the British to complete the other three Admiral class and make their own responses to that. But the era of Britain and Germany competing for the biggest navy in the world, I think, will well and truly be over. But Germany will still be there with, maybe they'll do like they might even copy the Japanese and do a kind of an 8-8 fleet where they go, we'll have 8 modern battleships and 8 battlecruisers, 16 modern capital ships as a respectable navy, certainly. But it is going to be smaller than what the Royal Navy has by a considerable margin. Coneled asks, if I recall correctly, Halsey was down near Australia for a bit after Coral Sea. What do you think happens if Yamamoto reacts to Coral Sea by thinking, I don't need to do Midway now since the Americans will fight over here, and immediately sends the Kido Butai south to support operations in the area? I think that's going to depend on how quickly, because you're correct. Enterprise and Hornet show up in the area right after the Coral Sea has been fought. So for a while, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown are all operating in the area, but on a fairly shoestring logistics chain. And of course, Yorktown's been damaged, so everyone decamps back to Pearl Harbor to repair, and then heads out for obviously what will become Midway. So I think it depends on just how quickly the Kido Butai react. Because if the Kido Butai sail within a few days of Coral Sea and basically try the whole Port Moresby operation again, this time with a lot more escorts, that could be very interesting. Because obviously the Americans will probably know that they're coming, but the Japanese also know that where the Americans are, which levels the intel playing field somewhat. And of course, Yorktown's air group is a little bit shot up. The ship itself is damaged, and at that point, if the entire Kido Butai is coming, you're going to have to make a call of, does everybody stay there, including damaged Yorktown, or do you all leave? Because you can't realistically just leave 2 carriers in the face of the Kido Butai. Alternatively, the fleet sails pretty much at the time that they sail for the Midway operation, i.e. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown are back in Pearl, except they are trying to do the Port Moresby operation, except bigger and better. If that happens, then in theory, the Japanese might have a slightly better time of it, simply because with all those islands in the way and the ability to deploy recon submarines or submarine lines well ahead of time, and the limited amount of approaches, in theory, the Japanese should know that when the American fleet approaches the general area, and thus you won't get quite the same level of surprise that you do at Midway. But that's... Excuse me. Long day. But that, it could go either way. I mean, just because you know that they're in the vicinity doesn't necessarily mean you're going to find them. But the Japanese will have a lot more scouting assets in the area, which increases their chances of finding them. So overall, Yamamoto piling into the Coral Sea area, by and large, probably will end slightly better for the Japanese than Midway did. Although, obviously, given the way that Midway ended for the Japanese, that's not exactly the highest of bars to clear. ACC asks, I'm getting the drink. The gods of naval spacetime have come down and named you Admiral for an upcoming Best of 3 series battle. You're given a generous but not unlimited amount of resources and a short time to take any museum ship in the world and restore it to fighting condition, train a crew of volunteers from your audience, and take it into one-on-one combat with a peer opponent. What ships do you choose? with a prep window of 3 months, 6 months, and a year, respectively. Oh boy. So I've got a decent amount of resources, good amount of volunteers. But we've got to restore some museum ships in 3 months. What could I get going in 3 months? Okay, well, if we're at the 3-month mark, I think pretty much the only museum ships that we're going to get moving are going to be ships that can still move under their own power anyway, which means probably small stuff. So, I mean, I know there's some PT boats, MTBs, MGBs out there that still work. There's some of the museum ships over in Sweden, some of the missile boats and stuff, they technically still work. So, yeah, let's take a Swedish fast missile attack boat out. We can probably get that running in 3 months, and it'll be quite fun. 6 months. That gives us a bit more time. I reckon in 6 months we could probably get HMCS Haida going. With a year, assuming that all of the necessary permissions and everything were in place. With large, if not unlimited resources and a year, we might get an Iowa going. I mean, we are talking about throwing stupid amounts of money, but we might get one of the Iowas working, at least long enough to get them out to sea. A lot of it's going to depend with all these ships, like what has frozen in place, because there is a chance that some rather sensitive machinery might just have locked itself permanently into a position. The other easy alternative, of course, is to just go, okay, we're taking Constitution out. Because, well, it's a museum ship, but it's watertight, it's rigged. We can make that work pretty easily. Oh, and Mark Bass pointing out, yeah, a couple of the Liberty ships still work. So yeah, you could take one of those out. So yeah, actually, maybe those would be our 3 stages. Swedish missile boat. Our 6-month stage is a Liberty ship, because we'd have to spend most of that time reactivating the guns and finding some kind of we'd have to find some kind of fire control system other than over there. And then, yeah, with a year, either we take Constitution out or we go for broke and try and get one of the Iowas moving. Okay, and because obviously we're taking 2 sets of questions from 2 Drydocks, we have Graham William Kidd's other Frankenship submission from this following month. The best Franken submarine for 1930 to 1945. Can I outdo Captain Nemo? So again, best of breed components, machinery, armor, armament, etc. Okay, so we shall take German pressure hulls, or the German approach to doing fairly thick pressure hulls. Actually, you know what? If we're doing a Franken submarine, stuff it. We're taking the German approach to making an extremely deep diving submarine. We're going to take the US machinery and torpedo data computer systems. We're going to take the British submarine ASDIC system. We're going to take the British approach to test and crush depth because that is the most conservative one, I recall, if I recall correctly. I think it's 0.57 as opposed to 0.66 ratio. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the design for X1, but much as it pains me, I'm not going to put guns on the thing, or, well, I'm not going to put the X1 style turrets on the thing. I'm basically going to take the X1, an X1 size sub, but with X1's agility, dive ability, rapid diving, etc., and make it a torpedo boat. More so than it was already. So we're going to have probably 8 reloadable tubes up front, plus 2 single shot tubes. So essentially got a sub that's got a T-class type 10 torpedo forward salvo, but has plenty of reload. So probably be 18. Let's say it's carrying 32 torpedoes in its bow. Well, 34 torpedoes in its bow, actually, because you'd have the 2 outside, but 32 internal. So you have 8 in the tubes and 3 full sets of reloads. Stick a couple of stern tubes on for good measure. Saved a bunch of weight by not having the gun turrets, but we are going to put something like, I don't know, waterproof, anti-aircraft guns. Ooh. I mean, it's that size. We might as well stick a 5-inch 38 on there for fun. So we've got the American torpedo data computer, but we're going to go with Japanese torpedoes because, well, they work and they're very fast and have ridiculous warheads. But we're going to put Torpex in them for even bigger boom. Probably put the British submarine detonators because they'll actually work. Yeah, I think that'll do nicely. Oh yes, and of course, ice cream machine. Well, no, not even the US boats technically were supposed to have an ice cream machine, but we shall steal one from another US ship. We have 5 more questions from the Patreon chats, then we're on to the super chats. Adony and Becky asks, if during Operation Cerberus the Germans had gotten a bit luckier, but neither of their capital ships had hit mines, do you think the size of the home fleet would have been significantly increased to deal with the threat? And if so, from what theatre and what ships do you think the British would have reassigned? I mean, yes, if both of the Scharnhorst make it through Operation Cerberus basically unscathed, then you have a potential threat, assuming the Germans can find the fuel for it, of the 2 Scharnhorsts, Tirpitz, the Scheer and the Lutzow, the 2 Deutschlands, and potentially Hipper and Prince Eugen as well. So you've got 4 heavy cruisers and 3 battleships. So at that point, the Royal Navy is going to want at least 2 cruiser squadrons substantially made up of heavy cruisers, plus at least another squadron of light cruisers, plus they're going to want probably at least 5 capital ships. So where are we going to get those ships from? I mean, you can't really take them out of the Mediterranean because you kind of need them there. The war has just broken out. In the Pacific. Obviously, carriers are something of a leveler, but only if the weather's good. Now, Well, I think what the British might do is leverage the fact that the US doesn't have a huge amount of fuel logistics going on. Therefore, they know that the US can't really stage huge numbers of battleships to escort their carriers anyway. And given that you don't historically see even the North Carolinas really doing all that much in the Pacific until kind of the late summer with the Guadalcanal campaign, the British might then go, look, there's this big enemy potential fleet threat, and have North Carolina and Washington sent over. That would help kick the numbers up. And historically, Washington did do a bit over in the Atlantic. So yeah, I think that you'd almost have a sixth battle squadron in miniature. You'd have a US presence. Obviously, Ranger was there for a bit. So you'd probably have one or two US fast battleships and the Ranger, plus the historic home fleet strength. And I think at that point it would be a case of, because these are going to be fast ships. You've lost Repulse, you've lost Hood, so you're going to have to get Renown in there. You're going to have King George V. You've lost Prince of Wales. So Duke of York when she comes online, Anson when she comes online, probably pull Nelson and Rodney in as well. They're slower, but they do have the firepower. So yeah, I think you'd see Renown, King George V, Duke of York, and because Anson's a little far off at that in early 42. So yeah, probably Nelson and Rodney as well, plus one or two American fast battleships, plus Ranger, plus at least one British aircraft carrier. Mike Lima 777 asks, what if the US could maintain a track of center force at the Battle of Sibuyan Sea via submarines or aerial reconnaissance? With the presence of both center force and the Northern Carrier Force, how would Halsey have deployed his forces, and how would you have ranged the Allied naval forces, assuming you weren't aware that the Japanese carrier wings were depleted of effective pilots? Well, if you know that you've got two Congos, a Nagato, and, well, initially until after Sibuyan Sea, two Yamatos, and then just Yamato coming after you, Halsey can't afford to ignore that. So, and he can't pull the 7th Fleet because they need to guard the southern area. So I think, I mean, Halsey's got his on New Jersey as flagship. Halsey really wants his carrier fight. I think probably what Halsey will do is keep two battleships with him, just as a safeguard, an anti-aircraft screen. Send the rest of the battleships, or well, keep the rest of the battleships, as well as some cruisers and destroyers at the San Bernardino Strait to intercept center force. But what he can do is also call up the Taffies, Taffy 1, 2, and 3, and basically tell them, look, gather all gather towards the north, where near Taffy 3 is, switch out for any anti-shipping ordnance you happen to have, and back up the carriers, because back up the battleship force, because you'd be talking about a battleship force that, hull-wise at least, is going to be on roughly even par, even if obviously the US fast battleships are arguably comfortably superior to Nagato, very superior to the Congos. Yamato maybe not so much, but you've got cruisers and destroyers backing you up, so that works. So the idea would be that if you're tracking them all the way, wait till they are passing through the San Bernardino Strait, get all the Taffies to launch their aircraft to do maximum disruption, whatever small numbers of torpedoes they've got, inflict damage, potentially inflict losses. Then when the Japanese force, the embattled Japanese force, appears out of the San Bernardino Strait, if I was in charge, I would actually be waiting for them with my destroyers up front and basically do a sort of a Johnston Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts style charge where you just dump massive amounts of torpedoes in the water at them, because then at that point they've got a choice of turn back or sail on through the torpedoes. And while they're dodging and weaving and trying to not get hit by massive waves of destroyer-launched torpedoes, that's when your cruisers and battleships open up on the hopefully already damaged Japanese fleet and get enough of an edge over them that you can start concentrating fire 2v1 on Yamato and grind the fleet down. So yeah, that would probably be a fairly effective way of doing it, and it still leaves you with battleships to escort the fast carrier force, and Halsey can go and beat up on Admiral Ozawa. Sapper Ninja asks, if the Royal Navy completed all 4 admirals, but they're forced to get rid of 3 of them after the Washington Treaty, but due to a large oversight by the Japanese and the Americans, the 3 are named HMS New Zealand, HMNZS New Zealand, HMAS Canada, and HMAS Australia, and HMCS Canada, and are quote-unquote sold to their respective navies. How do the timeline progress from there, and what concessions are forced at first and second London? How does World War II go? Does Graf B end up facing a couple of Admiral class? Okay, so by having them sold in quotation marks, presumably this means the Royal Navy is still paying for their maintenance. How does the timeline progress from there? Well, the Royal Navy is going to have to pay for their maintenance, because there's no way the RCN, the RAN, and, well, the New Zealand Navy, as and when it comes up to full force, can actually pay to maintain these things, nor would they particularly want to. But if the British are giving the Dominions subsidies for various things to essentially keep them running, that it could be made to work. Obviously, the Japanese and the Americans are going to be very annoyed by this, because it's blatantly obvious what's going on. The problem is, with battleship construction stopped, the only thing they can really do at first and second London, they can't force the British to scrap more ships. Obviously, Tiger's going away and so forth. The British won't have a problem with ditching the 13.5-inch ships at that point. If anything, at first London, the Japanese and the Americans might go, okay, look, haha, very funny, but you now have, well, 6 battle cruisers, including Renown and Repulse, and 5 yeah, because at that point you've got 5 Revengers, 5 Queen Elizabeths, and in theory you haven't mentioned they don't get the Nelsons, because they've just sold off the 3 Admirals, so you've got the Nelsons as well. See, it might be tempting to say, oh, we'll force them to get rid of the Renowns, but getting rid of 2 Renowns but effectively keeping 3 Admirals is still quids in for the British. So I think at that point the Japanese and the Americans will probably just have to go, okay, you got away with it that time, but we are going to now write into First London that we get to build at least 2, possibly 3. Well, probably the Japanese probably get 2, the Americans get 3 new capital ships to essentially catch us up with your sneaky ones. Which the Japanese might well be in favour of, depending on exactly how that works out ratio-wise. The British won't be very happy at all, but they can't really do much at that point. Maybe they can grab some concessions about being allowed to upgrade their existing fleet or something, rather than new build. Of course, with new build ships on the stock, the Japanese might not want to ditch second London quite so quickly, but they probably will anyway. But how does World War II go? Well, it does put the British initially in a much stronger position, because they've got 3 more essentially fast battleships to hand, assuming that they've all been maintained over the interim. And will Graf Spee end up facing them? I don't necessarily know about two, but certainly at least one of them. Because I think what the British might do is go, well, it might be tempting to say the British go, okay, we're going to put one in the South Atlantic, one in the Indian Ocean, and boost our home fleet strength by one. But to be honest, 4 admirals is such a powerful fast ship force, and the Germans only have fast capital ships, that I think what you might actually see is the 4 admirals congregated back at home into the home fleet, because they're now the fast reaction force that can dart out and kill pretty much anything. And at this point, the French have the force de raid still going, so they're going to be quite happily hunting for Graf Spee. So I think what you might actually see is Renown and Repulse shaken loose to go Graf Spee hunting. So essentially, the long distance hunters become Renown and Repulse. The core of the home fleet becomes the admirals doing high speed intercepts until King George V, etc., can show up, and all the slower ships get farmed out elsewhere. So at that point, the R's and Barham and Malaya probably get put on convoy escort, which would then mean that Warspite and then Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, when they come online, maybe Renown and Repulse once the hunting period is over, and Nelson and Rodney probably get given to Cunningham when the Italians pile in, which is going to make Cunningham a very happy man. Nosdormu89 says, congratulations, the Royal Navy and US Navy, through the magic of hand-waving, have made the decision to name a ship in the time period the channel covers after you. That said, what kind of ship is HMS Drachinifel and USS Drachinifel, respectively? You may add other navies to this if you wish. I mean, are they naming an existing ship or designing a brand new ship? But I mean, given the origins of where the name Drachinifel actually comes from, I mean, technically, to fit within existing naming conventions, USS Drachinifel would be a supply ship. There isn't really there's not really a precedent in the Royal Navy for a similar naming convention. I mean, the closest you'd get would probably be a town or a county class cruiser to vaguely fit the theme, but that's probably about so a supply ship and a cruiser of some description would probably be about as close as you could get to using the actual origin of the name Drachinifel in a appropriate manner to the classes of ships that would carry similar names in those navies. I mean, obviously, I might want it to be different, but it would clash rather harshly. And then our last Patreon question is Andrew Kirshenman asking, what are your thoughts on the whole design of the Celebrity Edge class of cruise ships? Oh no, I'm going to have to look these up, aren't I? Celebrity Edge class of cruise... Oh my flip's sake. Really? I'm going to have to look at these even closer. Why? You know, I thought aesthetically that it was not possible to do worse than the modern cruise ship. Clearly, I was wrong. This has all the appeal of an office block mated with a 1970s era British railway carriage. And what, the bow of a barge? Or possibly one of the milder French armoured cruisers? What is the purpose of this? Um, I'm, why? I mean, there's got to be some reason that they're doing them this way. But unless they're planning to ram smaller ships out of the way for the best berths, maybe they're going for that very slightly improved length to breadth ratio, like I was discussing in a recent Drydock. Maybe that's, but oh, okay. Well, at least I can add that to my list of ships I will never willingly sail upon. Oh boy. So yeah. What are my thoughts on the hull design? I can only guess that by having that kind of ramish bow thing going, that they are trying to buy themselves a couple of dozen extra feet on the length to breadth ratio to improve their fuel efficiency. That's my only guess, but other than that, yeah, no, nope, pass. I'm not. I don't want to look at them anymore. All right, so we have a. Right, so we have a few super chats to go through. So, just copying the last couple. Okie dokie. Okay, that's everybody. That's everybody copied over. So Nick's. No, I haven't done the war sales one because I haven't. We're only just starting on the super chats. So I know that's there. So I'm just going back through and copying over a few more. Right. Classe Cornet asks, can you detail the Utopia Anson incident? I mean, if I'm doing it live, I'm not sure about detail, but I can certainly give you a rough idea of what was going on. So the Utopia Anson incident is... Let me get this straight. Remember it. It's the end of the 1800s, so the end of the 19th century. As the name suggests, you've got a ship called the Utopia and a ship called Anson. Anson is HMS Anson, not the King George V class. It's one of the Admiral class ironclads, one of the last ironclads, actually, that the Royal Navy receives. And, well, it's sitting happily at anchor in Gibraltar, just the way that, you know, everybody usually is when you're in the Mediterranean fleet and you're at that end of things. And, you know, swinging quite stationary, not really harming anybody, which is, you know, slightly odd for a battleship, but there you go. And then along comes the this steamer, the Utopia, which has a whole bunch of people on board because it is a passenger liner, and they see that their anchorage, or the anchorage they want to get to at least, is on the far side. and they decide, for reasons mostly unknown, that they're going to go around Anson at fairly close distance. I think there's some debate as to whether they misjudged their turn and went in a lot closer than they should have done, or if they were blown down by the wind and they misjudged the wind, or they misjudged both. Probably both. But in any case, instead of going around the Anson, the Utopia kind of goes around and then drifts down onto the Anson, and being a late-era ironclad, of course, she has a ram bow. Utopia's a passenger liner, not really designed to take much in the way of any damage, let alone underwater ramming. And Anson kind of acts a bit like the iceberg does to the Titanic, rips open its side. The boilers, the engine room floods, Utopia goes dead in the water and sinks very quickly, and a lot of people drown, despite the fact that, well, there's a lot of ships right there, but Utopia goes down pretty fast, considering her largest underwater compartments have just had their sides ripped open by a ram. So, yeah, not good. Not good at all. If I remember correctly, the investigation spent a good chunk of time trying to figure out why on earth anyone would have been dumb enough to make that maneuver in the first place. Some people even suggested it might be insurance fraud. But I think one of the main arguments against insurance fraud is this was such a dumb and stupid thing to do that if it was fraud, anyone would guess that it was fraud. Therefore, it probably wasn't, because it's too stupid. But there you go. Mike Lima 777 asks, what if the Royal Navy used all-or-nothing armour starting in 1903? That would be quite a fun concept. Would it change much, though? See, the weird thing is, it probably wouldn't change all that much. The only place I can see it maybe, well, actually no, say that there's two places I can see an all or nothing armor scheme helping by consolidating all the armor thickness closer in. One of them would be the loss of the Indefatigable at Jutland, because being an Indefatigable class, obviously, she's only got 4-inch armor over her 4.5 magazines, and one of those is probably the one that cooks off first. So if she'd had all or nothing armor and therefore had 6-inch armor, like the Invincibles, over both her 4.5 magazines, at the range she was hit, it might have just about done enough to not get the magazines blown up. For Queen Mary, she wasn't penetrated through the armor belt anyway, so that doesn't really change all that much. Invincible, again, it's a fight at much closer range. Even having all or nothing 6-inch isn't going to help her, so that's not going to change anything. And at that point, the only other British capital ship that's lost in a gun action is going to be Hood. It might help her. It depends where they put the armor. So if they go all or nothing, if they take off the 2 strakes of armor higher up, if they just slap that on the 12-inch strake and go, hey, we've got a 13, 14-inch thickness, then assuming that my theory about how Hood is destroyed is correct, holds, it's not going to do them much good because the shell's still going to go underneath. But if they take those strakes of armor and they go, we're going to expand the coverage of the 12-inch plate, or maybe make it 12.5, 13 inches thick and expand coverage, kind of a happy medium, and part of that extends the armor downwards, and maybe they'll probably put a little bit of deck armor on at the same time, with the spare weight. That might make a difference, because if the armor is just that little bit lower, it might just about intercept the incoming shell. Or if they decide to go all or nothing and just use the weight saving to counteract the weight gain that's come in compared to the original Hood design, then Hood might be moving a little bit quicker, and thus the shell might not hit at all, or it might hit in a slightly different location that isn't quite so explosive. So yeah, Hood and Indefatigable's losses will probably be the main things that affects, because yeah, other than that, I can't think of much else it would affect, actually, to be perfectly honest. Um, Knight 6831 saying the Admiral class being all or nothing would reduce the weight. As I say, in theory it should, assuming they keep the armor thickness the same. I can see the designers though using it as an excuse to either spread out the 12-inch plate to cover more space or just thicken up the plate. But there you go. Nosdormu89 says, to make a good fighting vehicle is a balancing act of speed, protection, and firepower. My question is, in your opinion, which was the ship of each... Yeah. What was the ship of each class that came closest to the perfect balance? I'm presuming you mean like battleships, battlecruisers, etc., etc., etc. Okay. I'm going to leave out carriers because a lot of that is dependent more on the aircraft. Because, a ship with 90 aircraft that are pretty rubbish will probably lose against a ship that's carrying 60 or 70 aircraft if those aircraft are really good. But if we're looking purely at gun-based vessels, speed protection and firepower balance for battle cruisers would probably be a toss-up between the for ships that are built as opposed to ships that were just designed or ships that were converted partway through. For ships that were actually built, for battle cruisers, I think it'd be a coin toss between the Derflingers and Hood, ironically enough, because yes, Hood did explode, but overall, her speed protection and firepower balance were very good for the time, and wind back the clock a bit. And the Derflingers also, pretty well protected, pretty good on the speed, and they've got decent firepower for battle cruisers. The fact that Germany was still using the 12-inch gun at that point was slightly less important because you've got 8 guns, but the biggest British battle cruisers at that point are 13.5-inch ships, as opposed to 12-inch versus 15-inch over in the battleship category. For battleships, battleship's a good one. Because I can think of a few ships that are pretty solid designs, but they're slightly deficient in one area or another, which doesn't necessarily affect their overall efficiency as designs, but it does mean they're slightly unbalanced. Because, to be honest, even with the Iowas are some of the best ships out there. They're very fast. They've got ridiculously good firepower, but their armor, especially if you've got the whole rule of thumb of armored against your own guns, yes, it's angled, and I know that, but the armor's just a little bit thin. If you're going for perfect balance, the Montanas have the same guns, just more of them, and look at the massive increase in armor they gave them. Vanguard, good speed, very good armor. Yes, supercharged 15-inch 42s have decent firepower, but you still got to admit it would have been nice to have either 15-inch 45s or 16-inch guns on the things. Weirdly enough, my mind keeps coming back to Richelieu. Because once her shells stop exploding in the barrels, the guns are pretty good. The firepower's pretty good for the time. This is the other thing. Iowa and Vanguard are kind of mid to late warships. Richelieu is very much a immediately pre-World War II design. So for the ships that she's competing with, the North Carolinas, the King George V's, even the Bismarcks and the Littorias, Richelieu's got decent firepower, good speed, and her armor scheme is in theory relatively good as well. I mean, okay, yeah, Jean Bart does take a bit of a pasting at the Battle of Casablanca, but she is also half complete and stationary, so there is that. So yeah, I think relative to her time, Richelieu's probably at least for the main battery elements. But then at the same time, her anti-aircraft guns aren't all that much to write home about. So the other option, of course, would be the South Dakotas, because good main battery, good anti-aircraft battery, decent armor, decent speed. Yeah, I'd be happy with that. Obviously, there are a lot of compromises in the South Dakota design. In fact, they're very cramped, for instance, but that's outside of the classic triangle. King George V, I mean, she's okay on speed. She's the same speed as most of the other fast battleships, if a little bit faster than some even. Very good armor. But yeah, 14-inch guns. It's one of those weird things, because for the battles they actually have to fight, the King George V's guns are actually perfectly fine. But they could have ended up in fights with other ships where they might have found the 14-inch a little bit lacking. Cruisers, that's actually pretty easy. The Baltimores, because, well, everybody was kind of either building to the treaty restrictions or just lying about them. And although Algerie is the best of the treaty cruisers, in my humble opinion, she is still a treaty cruiser, having to cram a quart into a pint pot. Whereas Baltimore is basically the US going, we have our pre-existing heavy cruiser design, great, but how about we just essentially take that core concept in terms of its speed and firepower and add all the other bits that we wanted to but couldn't because of the treaty restrictions. And then you see with the Baltimore, that's what a modern late 1930s, early 1940s heavy cruiser should look like, well balanced. And yes, obviously you do have the things like the Zaras and the Hippers that lie about their actual displacement, but especially with the Hippers, the design inefficiencies are huge. So yeah, destroyers. I think destroyers is, you could make several different arguments for several different ships depending on what you view the primary role of a destroyer to be. Because, if you take a tribal class destroyer, if you think the role of a destroyer is to hunt down and kill other small surface ships, you're going to be a very hard place to beat a tribal. It's got ridiculous firepower and the captains are frankly insane. If you want a destroyer that can defend itself from air attack, though, tribal probably not so much of a good bet. Fletcher is much better bet at that point, but a Fletcher probably would lose a straight-up gunfight to a tribal. But a Fletcher also has more torpedoes. So, yeah. And you can make arguments, I think, for maybe 2 or 3 other destroyer classes as well. I think destroyers basically comes down to what you want the destroyer to do. And then you can pick the perfect balanced destroyer for that role. But I don't think there is a single destroyer you could point to where you could say, for that time period, that destroyer has the perfect balance of everything, because you could probably, something with a perfect balance should be able to have, even if not necessarily well, obviously it's not going to have a decisive advantage against a specialist, but it should be able to still go toe to toe reasonably well with a specialist. And when it comes down to destroyers, that's actually quite hard. Hand Over Fist 86 asks, could the US have made the Battle of Wake Island a Pacific version of Stalingrad, feeding just enough men and ships to the island to bog down the Japanese blitzkrieg? My grandfather was a 5-inch short battery crew member. Honestly, I don't think so, for two reasons. Firstly, if the Japanese are constantly there, feeding their own men and ships in, you are going to have to fight them. At which point it's not so much the island war that's the issue, it's the sea war. Because either the Japanese see your reinforcements coming and they kill them, so there aren't any reinforcements, or you bring a lot of friends and kill the Japanese ships that are off Wake Island, and if you do that, well, then the Japanese aren't invading Wake Island anymore because you sank all their ships. Yeah, I just the size of Wake Island, the fact it's so small, and one bad day either way could make all the difference. I don't think there's the size or the scope of the island to have a Stalingrad style long-term battle there as an infantry battle. It's going to be over a lot sooner, one way or another, from a naval perspective of who can actually physically get there and hold the seas around it. Class A Cornate asks, Indefatigable is sent down to Coronel and Von one-shots her, and Sturdy, who presumably for some bizarre reason has changed his flag to Indefatigable, through the front barbette magazine, and the other battlecruiser runs away in panic. How does this affect British battlecruiser thought? Well, the other battlecruiser who runs away is their captain's going to be court-martialed and probably flogged, if not shot, because that's just not what you do. I mean, in theory, if the other battlecruiser is an invincible class, in theory, the other battlecruiser actually still has the firepower to hunt down and kill Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, even if Indefatigable's blown itself sky high. But assuming that Indefatigable has exploded and the other battlecruiser just retreats, I mean, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing going, why the heck did you put 4-inch armor over the magazines of the bow and stern magazines of the Indefatigable? But also, she's the only ship with a 4-inch armor because New Zealand and Australia have 5-inch armor, which isn't hugely better, but it's something. I think it will probably drive the British to look into up-armoring at least the surviving I-types pretty darn quickly. And I mean, they might look at the armor of the 13.5-inch ships, but the armor of the 13.5-inch ships is already substantially better. So, yeah, you might see a kind of, like they did with Renown and Repulse, re-armoring them. You might see them re-armoring the eyes, and also then Renown and Repulse perhaps launching with straight-up thicker armor. I think they might also, yeah, apart from up-armoring them, I think they might also start either running the battle cruisers with light cruisers to see off enemy cruisers, or look into building a new class of heavy light cruiser that is fast enough and perhaps durable enough to keep up with the battle cruisers, but whose main role is to fend off light ships, with the kind of the battle cruisers acting as a heavy backup, which might be an interesting development. You're probably looking at something World War One-ish, 8 to 10,000 tons, something like that. Commandant Galileo, more on Hood. Well, not with her the way she came out eventually. That you might see Hood being designed from the ground up with the armor she has eventually, though, or something close to it. Antonius Pius asks, although I'm fairly well read in World War II, I didn't realise the US had a base in Trinidad. Info out there is limited, but articles imply it was quite important. Can you talk about its importance, and is there any chance of a video on it? I can't talk a huge amount. I actually need to learn to spell. I can't talk a huge amount about the base itself right this instant because I haven't done a huge amount of research on it. But what I can do, definitely, because it sounds quite interesting, is do a video on it. So the typing you saw me do just then, I have added it to my list of videos to cover in the first third of next year. So yeah, sorry I can't really cover it right now because frankly I don't know enough about it, but I can find out, and I will find out, and there, I can already see the title, The Hidden US Naval Base That Nobody Knew About. You kind of given me the title there. Sun, sea, and lots of guns? Who knows? Plus, I actually know a few people from Trinidad, so they may be able to, well, they're actually in Trinidad at the moment, so they may be able to go and poke around bits and pieces, and they might know a bit more as well. So that, yeah, thank you for bringing that to my attention. And well, there you go, guys. Now you know to expect, hopefully before before April, May next year, what one of the Wednesday videos is going to be on. Right, Nix the Puppy asks, how realistic are the naval battles in M and B war sails? What is M and... Oh, Mountain Blade. Oh, battle... Oh, yes, of course. This is the... this thing. Yes. Right. Let me have a quick look. I'm going to just quickly kick a video on, remind myself, turn off the sound, remind myself. Okay, yep, so it's, yes, right, it's all coming back to me now, right? Long ships, sailing along rivers, that's realistic. I'll give them that much. Oh, there's galley. Not sure so much about the incendiaries, but there you go. River galleys, definitely a thing. Right, how are we doing this? Oh, I know. I just need to... Where's the speed? Playback speed. Playback at 3 times speed. Okay. Select ship, attempt boarding. Okay, I would say that the types of ships for the setting that they've got are pretty realistic. The equipment that they've got, at least for the time period they're portraying, is pretty realistic. The use of catapults, what looks like flaming catapults, or some kind of flaming siege weapon as kind of large ship artillery. I mean, it kind of was a thing. The accuracy that they seem to be giving it is perhaps a bit ambitious. The idea of, yes, you would have a missile exchange from the raised stern of this galley that's going on. Yep, that's... I'd say probably the only... I mean, obviously it is a game, but I would say from what I've seen of it, the only bit that I would maybe dock some points in terms of realism for would be the and I think this is probably a game engine limitation, is the mechanics of the ramming to board. where people are trying to lay alongside, and the ship kind of just seem to bump together a little bit, and then that's it. Whereas realistically, especially in river battles where the waters are quite close and confined, you would get ramming. Ramming would be quite a jokes write themselves here. It'd be quite a physical thing. There would be quite a severe impact, and either the ships would naturally be wedged together, or they'd be trying to lash them together, and people would be trying to unlash them, and the boarding actions would get going a lot faster. But I have a feeling that's a limit of the game engines. And to be honest, I think that's a limit of most game engines when they try and replicate any kind of naval warfare that involves substantial amounts of ramming. You saw it in things like Rome Total War 2 and so forth. You get ships that are supposed to either be ramming and wedging together, or ramming and coming right up and getting jammed up together, and they just don't. It's almost like they have little personal force fields where they kind of bump, and then they kind of vaguely sit in close proximity to each other, and you can't really do much about it. I mean, weirdly enough, I think Empire Total War actually had slightly more realistic physics, at least in terms of the ships just straight up smashing into each other, even if they didn't really do much after that. But there you go. Right. Class A Cornate again asks, by retaining all 13.5-inch battleships and some of the 12s, the UK keeps the 2-power standard at Washington. How does this affect World War II rearmament? If this means the British get 4 Nelsons for the Nagatos and 3 Colorados. I mean, I'd love to see how the heck the British have afforded all of this, and why. Because, see, I don't think they would do even if they are going to do the 2-power standard, they wouldn't do it this way, because the Royal Navy was already in the process of decommissioning and getting rid of its 12-inch ships well before even the hint of the Washington Treaty was being written. They by the end, even by the end of World War One, they considered some of their earliest ships to be the Dreadnought herself and the Bellerophons were considered to be a bit past it and were being used in secondary roles. By 1919, 1920, the Royal Navy was in a sort of a crash course program of getting rid of all its 12-inch ships, because they just didn't see any viable role for them in the future. If they're going to be trying to maintain a 2-power standard, then yeah, okay, they might be trying to argue for more modern ships at the Nelsons and so forth. But one, obviously, the whole point of the Washington Treaty is that the Americans don't want the British to have the 2-power standard, but if they were going to, I think the British would do it by their kind of minimum threshold would be keeping the 13.5-inch ships. They definitely wouldn't keep the 12s, because, I mean, to be fair, if they keep the Orions, King George V's, and Iron Dukes, if we're hand waving exactly how they're doing this in the first place, that's 11, because obviously Audacious sank, and then you've got Lion, Queen Mary, and Tiger. So that gives you 14 ships. 24 with the Queen Elizabeths and the R's. 26, 27 with the Renown, Repulse, and Hood. And actually, at that point, technically speaking, all you need is... Actually, hang on. If for some bizarre reason the Americans and the Japanese agree to the Washington Treaty limits as they did historically, then actually, technically speaking, you've already got 2-power standard there without having. I mean, you get the Nelsons, but at that point, yeah, you have a 2-power standard without having to do anything more, because the Japanese, they consider the Fusos, Iseis, and Nagatos and Congos to be their full strength. So that's going to be 10 ships. And then the Americans, you've got... I mean, yes, historically they do keep the 12-inch ships, but the Americans have come to kind of the same conclusion about their 12-inch ships. So you'd have Texas and New York, Nevada and Oklahoma, Pennsylvania and Arizona, the 3 New Mexicos, the Tennessee and the California. That's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 if they build the Washington as well, the 4th Colorado. So 15 plus 10 is 25. The British, by keeping all the 13.5-inch ships, have 27. So yeah, even at that point, the British could afford to ditch either the Orions or King George, or the Lion and Lion and Princess Royal, and they could maintain a 2-power standard, just like that, just in terms of at least modern ships. So just copying down a few more super chats that have come in. Right, that's that one. Early Winters 09 asks. Oh, Early Winters 09 just says thank you, Drac. Thank you very much, Early Winters 09. Class A Cornate asks, the Chileans order 2 J3s, oh boy, to replace the Littores at the end of World War One. How does this affect World War Two if they join in December 1941? First question, how intact are they? Because Almirante Litore, she wasn't in the worst of conditions, but she certainly also wasn't in the best of conditions at the time. If they need a lot of work to get up to full battle status, there's also a question of fueling them, to be perfectly honest. Just copying out another super chat. But I mean, the J3s are some of the less aggressive of the British alphabet battlecruiser designs, and that, I mean, that is saying something. But they are kind of they're like the next generation. They're the next logical generation after the Admiral class. If they're in decent enough condition, and it's December 1941, if they're joining the Allied cause as a whole, I think they would probably actually be quite welcome in the UK, because being British-built ships, obviously they'll be much easier to maintain in the UK. They're armed with 15-inch guns, and at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, the British have, from their fast capital ships, they've just lost Repulse and Prince of Wales. They've lost Hood. So in terms of fast capital ships, they have, well, Renown and King George V. Duke of York's coming online, but I'm not sure that you could really consider her fully online at that stage. So yeah, that they only got 2 fast capital ships really at that point. And well, between the Italians and the Germans, there's an awful lot more. So having a couple of pretty nice 9-gun 15-inch warships showing up would go a lot of the way to making everybody feel a bit better. Of course, the fact is that the Germans don't come out, and I suppose you could give them, if you want them to actually see some proper action, you could send them to the Mediterranean to fight with Cunningham, because he will go after the Italians if he's got those 2 on hand, once they've been obviously properly fitted out and modernized. But I have a feeling the British might might put them in the home fleet to guard against the Germans, and maybe detach one or two of the ships that were in the home fleet historically and send them to the Mediterranean instead, which will be slightly slower ships. Michael D'Antoni. So Michael D'Antoni is just asking, this is a live, so we've got through the Patreon questions. Everyone's welcome to be here, obviously. We've got through the Patreon questions. We're working through the Super Chat questions. And then once I work through the Super Chat questions, of which I'm currently 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, dang, there's about 10 or so. At the moment, at least, then I'll get to regular chat questions, which, yeah, I mean, this is going to be interesting since I'm already fairly tired. I don't think this is definitely not going to be another one of those 4-hour streams, but hey, we've been going 2 hours, 10 minutes. We'll definitely reach 3 at least. Classic Ornate. How do you rate the all-forward and echelon design for the Proto 1029 North Carolinas? Oh, the Proto North Carolinas for design efficiency. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm not a big fan of an echelon generally. I can understand why they looked at it in terms of, minimizing citadel length in order to maximize protection and so forth. Especially when you're looking at quads, if you're trying to do the quad 14s all up front. But there are a lot of limitations to doing an echelon. It starts to impinge on your ability to protect the side of the ship. You basically have to compromise of either you're not doing it as far out as you want, or you start eating into torpedo defenses and so forth. And you do start ending up with barbettes and so forth, worryingly close to armor, which you might not think is so much wrong, because surely the armor should resist incoming firepower, and if it doesn't, then, well, you're in trouble anyway. Well, yes, but if the armor is, 15, 20 feet that way, there's still space for an incoming shell that's just about made it through to potentially go off without killing your magazine. And then you look at, actually, considering we're looking specifically at the North Carolinas, look at North Carolina herself when she is torpedoed and how close that came to ending badly. And if she'd been the N echelon turret design, yeah, move that magazine 10, 15 feet, 20 feet closer to the edge of the ship, and that could end very badly. No Alien in This Can asks, visiting SMS Lytha, I found it rather sterile. Do other museum ships smell similarly? Like, do they smell of burnt coal, burnt gunpowder, etc., to feel more authentic? I think it depends on the ship that you visit. So, wooden ships, by dint of the fact they are made of organic material, and you've got things like pitch and tar, especially on warm days when the pitch and tar and paintwork and everything gets a little bit softer, wooden museum ships can very often smell, if you like, quite authentic rather than sterile. Lytha, that's, for those of you unaware, that's the small river monitor in Hungary. Lytha is also restored. So some ships, like the Iowas, the South Dakotas, etc., or even Belfast for that matter, they were taken from obviously live service to reserve to museum ship. So they always they vaguely looked the way they do now when they became into museum ship service. And so for those ships, especially in some areas, they do have a degree of some of the smells that you would actually have had back when they weren't museum ships, because there's just things like accumulated grit and grime and areas that haven't been fully restored, and little stains of diesel fuel and stuff down in the bilges, which all add to the atmosphere. but they will still be a lot more sterile than they would have been in active service, because obviously there's not several hundred low thousands of men living in them 24/7. And other ships are going to be somewhat in between. But yeah, restored ships particularly will tend to be a relatively sterile experiences, unless for whatever reason the people who operate them have gone for some kind of authentic element to it all that it might help. But I think part of the problem would be if you were going to have like a smell of burning coals or gunpowder or whatever, either that would be a very expensive scent system, which museum ships would probably view as a needless frivolity, or you'd actually be burning substantial amounts of coal and gunpowder every few days to keep the smell going, which, yeah, that there's all sorts of issues with that. Eric Hutton 1980 asks, how would the Battle of the Atlantic have gone for the Allies had they started building escort carriers in 1939-40? I mean, obviously better. My main concern with that wouldn't necessarily be the capabilities of the escort carriers, because, well, obviously even the very first ones when they came in, they were very useful. My broader concern would be whether or not they had the forces to escort them, because, of course, you have very, very early escort carriers like the Audacity. Great, fantastic, right up until she gets torpedoed, because, well, the convoys at that point are struggling to scrape together the number of escorts they need for the convoy, let alone having also escorts specifically for the escort carrier, which is going to become a very high priority target. But if they dedicate, let's say, a dozen or so escorts that are purely, these are escort carrier escorts, and maybe form what you might think of as a proto-hunting group, rather than running with individual convoys, I think their single biggest impact on the Battle of the Atlantic in terms of easing casualties would be to use them to try and close the mid-Atlantic air gap pretty much ASAP. So, kind of like some of the very early escort groups, then, yeah, there's like some of the very early convoy escort groups, or convoy escort forces, which would, they'd go out and meet a convoy and take it through the most dangerous part of the Atlantic, and then they'd break off and go and find another convoy to escort. You could similarly do that, where rather than attaching an escort carrier to a specific convoy, you might put an escort carrier and some long-range escorts out into the middle of the Atlantic and say, okay, according to our intelligence, you need to go roughly into this area and look around with aircraft to hunt U-boats, and then this convoy is coming along, so kind of vaguely attach yourself to it and support them just through the bit that the coastal-based aircraft can't cover, and then pick up this other convoy, and so on and so forth. That would be the best use of them, because obviously they're also going to be in limited numbers. Excuse me. As I said, it's been a very long day. Class A Cornate asks, the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, and 5 Montanas versus the Nagatos, 5 Yamatos, and 2 A150s, assuming that the 4th South Dakotas go 2v1 with the 2 Yamatos. Assuming 2v1, 2 Yamatos. Okay, so 2 South Dakotas, so that leaves us with 3 Yamatos and 2 A150s. So we've got a 5-on-5 between Yamatos and A150s versus Montanas. And then that leaves the North Carolinas as the wild cards. Oh no, the North Carolinas are no selling the Nagatos. That's an interesting fight, assuming that it's taking place in your kind of standard, flat, calm, bright, sunny day environment. There is a potential for the Japanese to win this, because a lot of their ships are flinging some very, very big and very, very nasty shells. However, we are talking the Montanas here, with quite substantial armor and a lot of 16-inch 50 caliber guns. The North Carolinas should usually come out on top against the Nagatos. 2 South Dakotas versus 1 Yamato twice over. The odds are in favor of the South Dakotas at least getting the upper hand. And then the North Carolinas could come and help finish them off. So if you like the smaller ships battles, there'll be losses and damages, but the Americans should win that. And then the 5v5, I've got to give it to the 5 Montanas. They've got slightly better fire control. I mean, when we're talking about flat, calm, sunny environment, a lot of the advantages the Montanas have disappeared, but ultimately their fire control system has still got a little bit of an edge, especially once, smoke and shell splashes start coming into effect. But when you've got either 9 or even 6 guns with the A150s versus 12 guns, and you have some of the reload issues you're definitely going to have on the A150s and might have with the Yamatos, if you've got a dozen 16-inch 50s regularly spitting out radar-directed salvos, statistically speaking, they're going to start scoring meaningful hits a lot sooner. Of course, it is entirely possible that somebody on an A150 gets a really lucky shot and sends a 20-inch shell straight into a Montana's magazine and blows it to bits in the first 10 minutes of the engagement. But I would say, statistically speaking, the Americans going to, I'd say the first 15 minutes, half hour of the battle would be the dangerous bit where it could go either way. But assuming that most of the ships involved are still afloat and haven't catastrophically detonated by that point, it's going to become more and more obviously an American victory. Class A Cornet asks, Fisher gets electrically shocked to death on Inflexible. That's the Ironclad. Therefore, it doesn't become First Sea Lord, so the mass scrapping in the Royal Navy never happens. How would you deploy them in World War One? I wouldn't, to be honest. An awful lot of the ships that that got scrapped by Fisher really have no practical use in the First World War in any kind of combat-related role. However, if I absolutely have to, the slightly less terrible ones that are in reserve would at least make half-decent convoy escorts against, or merchant ship escorts against the potential of surface raiders. So you would, at least with the better of them, you would at least be able to flood the general sea lanes with ships to try and hunt down and deal with all the random German surface raiders from that period, that the Cap Trafalgar and stuff like that. After that, armored troop transports for Gallipoli. That might kind of work if you actually. I mean, they did kind of do this with a freighter as well, and then they did it with the Vindictive at Zeebrugge and Ostend. Given that these things are going to be pretty useless otherwise, actually just up armor their bows, take out a whole bunch of coal and other extraneous bits and pieces. If necessary, fit gun shields on the guns if you've got some of the barbetted ones and so forth. Pack them full of troops and then just ram them ashore at Gallipoli and use them as massive, heavily armoured artillery fire bases from which to deploy troops. It might not do much good, but I can't see the Anzacs complaining about having, a small fleet's worth of heavy artillery and rapid fire weaponry behind inches upon inches of iron and compound and early steel armor just sitting there blasting away at point blank range. Um, and a lot of them are probably going to end up getting scrapped anyway. It'll just take a little bit longer. I think they'll probably hang around until the Dreadnought race gets going in earnest. But once it does get going in earnest and the Navy estimates start going up and up and up, especially in that kind of wibbly wobbly bit where we get the 3 Bellerophons and the 3 St. Vincents, yeah, I can see the government at that point going, well, if you really, really want the money for those ships, you're going to have to make cuts elsewhere, at which point at least the ironclads are probably going to go. Eric Hutton asks, have you covered the service of ocean liners in their service as hospital ships and troop ships during the World Wars? I did a 5-minute guide on hospital ships, although that was mostly purpose-built stuff. So I don't think I've done anything extensive on ocean liners in specifically their service as hospital and troop ships in that time period. I guess it's something else to go on the list. Frank Spazzato asks, if North Carolina wasn't torpedoed and South Dakota was still bombed at Santa Cruz and reduces the number of main guns that can be used, Henderson still goes the way it did, would Lee bring only North Carolina with him, or would he bring South Dakota as well? Is it better to have both North Carolinas or South Dakota instead? I think it's the more the merrier, if he's even allowed, because bear in mind, being sent in with those 2 ships was very much a last-ditch effort because the US was running out of cruisers. If he's even allowed to take them all, I think I would take them all, because, yeah, you know that the previous night there were 2 Japanese battle cruisers out there. You don't strictly know if the other 2 aren't going to show up, and if it's going to be Kirishima and a bunch of cruisers as it was historically, well, an additional battleship just means more killing. As Homer Simpson says, increase my killing power, eh? But against the relatively unlikely but potential happenstance of the Congo and Haruna showing up, well, having 3 battleships against 3 battlecruisers is always good. So yeah, I think despite the damage to South Dakota, if North Carolina was there and they had the fuel, they would have taken all 3. SOB Second Class asks, how much standard displacement and shaft horsepower would the Iowas need to have the armor layout of the North Carolinas but thicker? 6-inch deck, 13.5-inch belt at 19 degrees and same speed. Well, oh. Well, the North Carolinas don't have 13.5 inches. Well, oh, I see. North Carolina's but thicker. Right. Okay. So the armor layout. Right. I get you. Okay. So to maintain the speed, but have 6-inch deck armor and 13.5-inch angle belt armor the way the North Carolinas do on an Iowa hull. The weird thing is it's not going to add that much tonnage compared to the size of the ship. Now, I could answer this one of 2 ways. See, one way, which admittedly is slightly snarky, but still, is to point out that while obviously you've got the whole debate of exactly how fast an Iowa could go, I think everyone can pretty much agree the Iowas can go somewhat faster than their officially rated 33 knots. Exactly how much faster is kind of up to you to decide. At which point, if you stuck 13.5 inches of belt armor on them, they'd probably just hit 33 knots. That's the snarky answer. However, if you wanted to have their actual performance, with that extra armor, what could you do? Okay. One way you could do it would be eliminating the conning tower. That would save you a bunch of weight. And shorten up the aft superstructure a little bit. And then move the forward and aftmost 5-inch 38 mounts to the center line so that they're super firing over the turrets. And that allows you to also eliminate 2 of the 5-inch 38 mounts and maintain the same broadside. So you'd have 3 broadside mounts and 1 fore and 1 aft mount. So you have a 5 turret 10 gun salvo either side, but you can't do a 10 gun salvo to both sides at once. So which is effectively a slightly expanded US cruiser layout for the period. So that would save you the weight of 2 full 5-inch 38 mounts plus the weight of the conning tower. I think that would probably buy you enough weight and space that you could then up the belt armor by 1.5 inches and get away with it. John Thomas asks, I tagged you on a photo of USS Oklahoma sitting after refloating and stripped down prior to leaving Pearl Harbor. Curious if you know which battleship was tied up next to her. I think I know which photo you're talking about. Let me see if I can find the tag at least. Or the photo. This is probably the best way to show the photo, I think. Yes, if I download it, yep. So, I probably need to put the light level up. Right, so I think if you can hopefully see that. I'm watching my own stream and then realizing this 30-second slowdown. There we go. Yeah, if it's that photo that you mean, I believe that is the USS Wisconsin. That's what it's commonly attributed to be, at least. I mean, it's obviously an Iowa class, but as I say, the original picture, if I recall correctly, does tag it as Wisconsin. It's definitely not New Jersey. Otherwise, that photo would be everywhere on the ship. So I'd be tempted to go with the normal identification of it as Wisconsin because, well, it's 1 in 3 and it's what NHHC says it is. So I'm going to go with them. Frank Spazzato said, thanks for covering the post-World War II destroyers. Are there any other ships that go to your end date that you're looking to still cover? Perhaps with the Forestals as the last carriers. I don't think I'm going to do carriers past the midways because honestly, I've done a 5-minute guide in the United States. Maybe I'll do a standalone longer video looking at the USS United States, but see, the problem is once you've done the midways and the Audaciouses, etc., everything apart from the Forestals stalls out in some way, shape, or form for the late 40s and very, very early 50s. And the Maltas don't get built. The French don't build anything until the Clemenceaus. They're well after the time that of the channel. The Russians don't build anything close to the time of the channel. It's literally just kind of tried to build the United States, and then the Forestals came along. So I think maybe I'd do a longer video on the USS United States, the aircraft carrier, and that's about it. In terms of other ships, we've done the battleships of the future. I vaguely remember doing the cruisers. I know I've done 5-minute guides for most of them. I suppose I could do a special on the auto-loading cruisers and the cruiser design. So, you know, the Des Moines, the Worcesters, the Minotaurs, etc., etc. Kind of do a slightly longer look at each one in that kind of history of format. But I think that'll probably be about it for ships going. Maybe the very first post-war submarines. You know, kind of a mixture of, hey, here's a bunch of cool stuff that we were planning right at the end of the Second World War, and here's a bunch of stuff that's also somewhat impacted by our capture of Type 21 and Type 23 German Electra boats, that kind of stuff. I can see maybe that meriting a video, perhaps wrapping up with either the Albacore or the Nautilus. Cliff the Lightning asks, which of the Tromp-class destroyer leaders would you consider to be the better design? The lead ship completed to the original specification, or the Van Heemskerk, which was fitted out in the UK? I think it depends very much on what you end up doing with them. For the original design purpose of basically being almost like Capitani Romani style, although it predates them, kind of, or Aurora, World War I Arethusa type, I guess, kind of a very large destroyer flotilla leader dash extremely tiny light cruiser. The Tromp, as originally fitted, is the better ship, obviously, because it's actually fitted the way it's supposed to be. However, the anti-aircraft ship that Van Heemskerk became is probably the better bet for the Second World War, because if you want to use her in her role as a flotilla leader, she can put out a ridiculous number of shells, which is, you know, the other way of doing flotilla leaders. Rather than having bigger guns, just have more. And obviously much better anti-aircraft firepower. So for the war that you actually end up having to fight in World War II, the Van Heemskerk was probably the better equipped. Frank Sposato says, would you know how many total battleship shells the UK and Germany built for both World War I and World War II? I hope you enjoyed seeing Mikasa, and was that your last battleship to visit? Yes. So the second part, yes, Mikasa was the last preserved battleship, at least if you're going by steel battleships, that I needed to visit. If you count ships like, well, if you count Victory as a battleship, she was obviously a first-rate ship of the line. Well, I've seen her as well, but so if you want to go with purely by steel battleships, then there are 9 ships in the world. I think, is it 9? Or is it 8? Because you've got the 4 Iowas, 2 South Dakotas is 6. Alabama is 7. Mikasa is 8. So yeah, in terms of afloat museum ships that are float museum battleships of steel, there are 8. In terms of ones that you can visit, you obviously can visit the Arizona War Memorial, which is 9. And you can see Utah's wreck, but you can't visit it per se. And so yes, that she was the last of those. And yeah, if you extend it to victory, well, then she was the last of 10 instead of the last of 9. In terms of, would I know how many total battleship shells the UK and Germany built for World War One and World War Two? Not off the top of my head. The records will be out there though, because they tended to order them in large batches. So in theory, if someone knew where to look in the right archives, you could find that out. Intriguing. So yeah, I don't know at the moment, but theoretically I know the right levers to find out if I had some spare time on my hands. St. Nylan asks, thank you for your video on the Navy Record Society. Having joined, I feel like an 8-year-old having the pick and mix before going to the cinema. Yeah, I would thoroughly recommend, by the way, if anyone hasn't, joining the Navy Record Society. Because, yeah, it's a yearly subscription. It's a pretty reasonable subscription, given that you get electronic PDF access to everything they have ever published, which is a whole load of extremely useful information, and all the cool articles and stuff they do. Yeah, it's really, really fun. And also, yeah, if anyone wants to know, where do I sometimes come up with these sort of really funny and odd quotes and random esoteric side notes and stuff. A lot of it is from Navy Record Society publications, because as well as a lot of other interesting stuff, they also publish the collected papers of various admirals and sailors and so forth. So you've got the official biography of Admiral Cunningham, but they also publish the Cunningham papers and the Milne papers and the Beatty papers and so on and so forth. So you can just go through them and go, look, in this letter to this officer, which is obviously not the official word of what in the record, but this is what he was saying to this other guy. He really wasn't happy about this. Those books are kind of where I find a lot of those little gems. Oh, of course, Eric Hunt, the Texas. How could I have forgotten? USS Texas. Okay, yes. So in terms of intact-ish battleships, there are 9. Iowa, Wisconsin, New Jersey. I've forgotten the other Iowa now. Iowa, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Missouri. Then you've got Massachusetts and Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, MacArthur. 9 afloat steel battleships. Arizona Memorial, if you want to include that, and Victory, if you want to include that. But yes, I have actually been to all of them. MacArthur, however way you want to count it, MacArthur was the last one. Redosaurus. John Prados, author of Storm Over Leyte, claims Ukagi commanded Center Force since Kurita was too exhausted from all the past attacks. Do you agree? As far as I can recall, Kurita was certainly either approving orders or giving orders for at least part of Center Force's engagement. I mean, certainly Ukagi probably should have been in command for parts of Center Force's at least sailing, if not necessarily full engagement, because Kurita, well, he'd been half drowned. He'd had to fight Sibiyan Sea, had his flagship blown out from under him, and then found himself stuck on Yamato. So he certainly needed rest, but I mean, I'd have to go back over Storm Over Leyte to see exactly what he's saying, because I mean, I can't recall offhand, but there's a difference between saying Kurita wasn't in charge, Akagi was, which I don't think would be accurate, or Kurita was kind of standing there in a semi-zombie-like state while Ukagi kind of said, "Sir, we should probably do this. So we should probably do that. Probably do that." And Kurita's going, "Yeah, whatever," which is more plausible. But I would need to go back and check. I mean, it certainly wouldn't surprise me if Ukagi was making a lot of decisions while Kurita kind of stood there going, "Well, what time is it? Okay, cool thing. Oh, there's an explosion." Because, yeah, I mean, to be fair, if I'd been up for 36 to 48 hours and been blown off of one ship into the water and hauled into another, I'd probably be standing there vaguely coherent. Frank Sposato asks, have you heard about Robert Lundgren's theory about how Kirishima and Musashi had hydrogen explosions from their beehive shells? Any further thoughts, if so? I've heard of the theory. I haven't actually had a chance to look into it in more detail, though. I mean, both Kirishima and Musashi also had other issues with large amounts of American ordnance arriving on them. But, I mean, I could see off the top of my head, given the ingredients that went into the beehive shells, I could see how water getting into there could cause potentially hydrogen to generate, which would be a complicating factor they didn't really need. Exactly how much of a complicating factor, obviously, I don't know offhand. I'd have to check out his theory, but I've heard of it. I just haven't had a chance to look into it in sufficient detail to form an opinion one way or another. But, as I said, I can see how potentially it could certainly make things worse. Redosaurus, did you ever play any of the Warship Gunner or Commander games in the 2000s? And if so, do you still have or play them? Unfortunately not. Back in that period, I was basically playing mostly the various Total War games and Navy Field. I never quite got into Warship Gunner, because if I remember correctly, at least I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but at least in the UK, I vaguely remember that series being on console, I think. I mean, you are talking about like 2 decades ago, but I vaguely remember them being console games, and I've always been a PC player. Mike Lima 777. And we're on the last but one super chat. The Spanish bought Vickers 15-inch guns meant for Riachuelo. If Vickers built 100 extra guns, optimistic salesman that they were, how useful would they be for the Royal Navy? Very. If you've got that many extra guns, the Royal Navy might start just looking for places to stick random 15-inch guns just because. Again, there's the whole prestige thing, and also the fact they were trying to move on to a new 15-inch 45. But if you've got that many extra 15-inch guns lying... Oh. I've just realized something. I was thinking too far in the future. No, I should be thinking in World War I terms rather than post-World War I. Because I was going to suggest maybe they'd just put a bunch of 15-inch 42s on the Nelsons and call it a day because, hey, you've got the guns. But I just realized if we're talking about Riachuelo period, and so pre-World War I, just before World War I, and they start building... and they just start mass building 15-inch guns for no apparent reason, well, you're probably going to want turrets for those things. So, one, a lot more 15-inch monitors. Two, Fisher might get more renowns. Because you can see Fisher going, oh, we took materials and gun turrets and stuff that had been designed for renowned repulsion resistance when they were R-class, and we built 2 renowns out of it, but now we've got all these extras. I want to build more. Please don't let him build more Courageouses, though. But yeah, I can see the Royal Navy almost using the 15-inch 42 is the hammer, and now every problem looks like a nail. It's like, what is the solution to our problem? Put a 15-inch 42 on it. That's quite a scary thought, actually. And yeah, like, I mean, heck, at that point, the admirals, the other admirals might be built a little bit quicker because, hey, you've got the main armament sorted already. So yeah, I think that the Royal Navy might end up with just more 15-inch armed ships by the end of World War One, because the constant refrain will be, we've already got the guns, we need to put them on something. But even if they only get a modest increase in the number of 15-inch armed ships, I think by the time you get to World War Two, well, you're not going to have problems with worn-out guns or anything. There'll probably be a bunch more 15-inch coastal batteries as well. And heck, at that point, they might even stick a bunch on rails and, go and keep the US 14-inch railguns company and blowing up the Germans on the Western Front. Yeah, and then our final super chat so far is BudGuy8829, who says, on BB62's channel, that's New Jersey, they found plans where the US Navy thought they could get 18-inch 48 caliber guns made to fit the Iowa class gun turrets if the 18-inch guns were made with a 1930s and 1940s tech. What do you think of that? I mean, they'd already made a lightweight 16-inch 50 to fit in a turret where the 16-inch 50 Mark II couldn't, so they built the 16-inch 50 Mark VII. I can see it working. I mean, it's a lot heavier, so that would be an issue. But it's not so much heavier that you couldn't address that with work elsewhere. And because, I mean, yes, that's a bigger gun. It's still going to be slightly longer because you can, 2 calibers less, but 2 inches more. But ultimately, 16 inch. No, it would fit. It would fit, through the gun ports. You'd obviously have to redo the mountings and the hoists and everything. But theoretically, it could be done. Though the weight issues would be interesting, to say the least. I think your main worry would be crowding in the turrets with all the bigger hoists, bigger guns, bigger gun cradles, etc., etc. And if you've ever been in a 16-inch 50 caliber turret, it's not exactly the world's roomiest area in the first place. But maybe with a bit of work, yeah, I think you'd probably be just taking the turret clean off and completely redoing the interior. But it could kind of be made to work, I suppose. That would have been an interesting one. I suspect the designers would have been a lot happier with doing a twin 18-inch instead of a triple, or repurposing the existing turret as a triple. But if they had to, maybe. Right, so we've done the Patreon questions, we've done the super chat questions. So I think, because I am quite tired, I think we're going to run this until, I'm going to say, around 11:30 my time, which is another just under 40 minutes. And yeah, and then we'll go with that and wrap up at 11:30 at night. Seems fair, considering I've got a long drive and a bunch of filming I need to do tomorrow. Animal 16365 says, could the US Navy have made new breeches for the 16-inch 50 Mark II guns to make them fit on the Iowas? I don't think so. The amount of, if I recall correctly from when I looked into this, the amount of shaving down they would have had to do to make the old Mark IIs fit into the turrets that as they had been designed, especially with the balance issues and everything, they would have started coming dangerously close to compromising the safety of the breaches. Because, of course, one of the reasons the breach structure is so large is to contain the force of the explosion that's sending the shell downrange. Once you start cutting that down substantially, you do substantially increase the risk of things going kaboom, not in a good way. So, yeah, theoretically possible, but I wouldn't want to be the one in the turret. Put it this way. Marcus Danielson 498 says, in the Studio Ghibli film The Wind Rises, there are scenes featuring either Nagato or Mutsu and Hosho with an escorting Wakatake or Kamikaze class destroyer. Could you take a look at the pictures and see how accurate the animation is to the real ships? I could send pictures in whichever channel on the Discord you prefer. Sure, drop me a direct message in Discord and I will see what I can see. I mean, I might not be able to answer it this time around, but if you drop me a DM in Discord, I'll have a look and either message you back tomorrow or something like that, or answer it in the next live stream or whatever. Right, so I'm going to try and pick up questions. I'm going to pick up questions to avoid having to scroll back and back and back and back. I'm going to pick up questions from after, from around about Bud Guy 8829's super chat, if you can see that. If the computer will let me have control of my chat back. Stop it. Get off. Thank you. Right. All right. So, Knight 6831, would HMS Hermes R12 laid down in 1944 fall outside of your cutoff point? No, because it was laid down in 1944. Just because it wasn't finished for ages doesn't mean, I mean, technically the Ark Royal and Eagle were finished for quite a long time, but they were laid down pre-1950, so yeah, I can look at that. Eggril says, good evening all, greeting. What the? Chrome crashed because I was out of memory, apparently. That was fun. Where were we? Eggril 6362 says, good evening all, greetings from a Norwegian Navy warship. Hello, Eggril, and I hope you're having a nice time out there, wherever you are. Michael D'Antoni says, Russia has a couple of cruisers and a functional replica of an 18th century warship. Yeah, practically zero chance of me seeing any of them anytime soon. I mean, I did go and see Aurora back in, when was I at university? 2005, I think, is when I went and saw Aurora. So I have seen Aurora. I haven't seen their other ships, though. And as I said, very unlikely to see any of them anytime soon. Halo 3 Zoka says, do you have any audiobook recommendations about the Atlantic World War II side? Not off the top of my head, but if you email me or message me on Discord, I can have a look through Audible and so forth and see if I can pick out a few of good books that are also available in audiobook format. So yeah, drop me a message and I'll happily take a look if you care, if you want me to. JP Calibo says, have you ever covered World War II shipyards? I'm from Washington State and I'm very interested in the Vancouver W.A. Kaiser shipyard, mostly because they produce almost 50 Casablanca-class carriers. I've mentioned them in passing, mostly when I've been discussing the ships that they built. I haven't looked specifically, I think, at specific World War II shipyards yet. That definitely could be something to look at in the future. It just means having to acquire a whole new tranche of books, because obviously there are books about the specific histories of the shipyards, but they tend to be very different from the kind of books that most of the stuff that I have. Although, thanks to the rather wonderful Ian Johnston, who's published a whole ton of books on the subject, I've got plenty of stuff about the Clydebank shipyards. Right. What's going on there? Whoa. Captain Seafort says, do you have any plans for more ship comparison videos along the lines of the Bismarck-Littorio one? Yes, sort of. So, yes, it is a format I would like to do perhaps a few more in, but I need to find not an excuse, but kind of a justification for particular pairings, if that makes sense. So, I mean, Iowa versus Vanguard, maybe. King George V and North Carolina, perhaps. Queen Elizabeth and Bayern might be a good one. Dreadnought versus Comanche versus Nassau versus South Carolina, the first dreadnoughts. That might be also something that could be done. But yeah, it's coming up with matchings that would be interesting when people go, oh, okay, which of those 2 or 3 is actually better, as opposed to I don't know, Iowa versus King George V or something, because there's obvious disparities there. Mildly Historical asks, Drac, with the benefit of hindsight, what would have been a better tonnage limit to make balanced 16-inch and 8-inch gun ships? 38,000-ton battleships and 12,000-ton heavy cruisers? I think the problem is if you up the tonnage limits at Washington, people are just going to build up to that at Washington, maybe put an extra gun or 2 on or something, and you're going to be back to square one of, you maybe have 12-gun 8-inch ships and 10 or 12-gun 16-inch ships, something like that, and you're still going to have issues trying to find enough space for anti-aircraft guns, etc. Anyway, what it might have been better to do, although I'd love to see how you could get the political clout to actually do it, would be to keep the 35,000 and 10,000 ton limits at Washington, but then have London, perhaps at London 1, they go, okay, we have to acknowledge anti-aircraft guns are going to be taking up a lot more space and weight than we thought they were, torpedo defenses and so forth, so we do need to increase the tonnage limits. And they did have a 3,000-ton kind of improvement allowance. So maybe at London they go, okay, we're still not going to build new capital ships. We're going to extend the battleship building holiday. But when that expires, the new limits are going to incorporate that 3,000-ton improvement block. So 38,000-ton and 13,000-ton at that point. And then a new 3,000-ton block for those ships to be improved in 10 years after they're built or something will be available. No More Names says, wanted to say that Caliban and the Yankees is a great source for the US base on Trinidad's impact on that island. Okay, let me have a quick look at that, maybe. Right, I can shortlist that as something to look into. B-Boy says, if the Royal Navy had built the Malta class, would British carriers be more like American super carriers? Yes. I mean, I've said before, I've actually run the numbers, and in theory, the Royal Navy basically going, we're just going to have 4 Maltas and maybe the 2 Audacious's and scrap everything else, would actually be, in the medium and long term, a cheaper option than the hodgepodge that they kept around historically. Right, I am actually going to have to wrap this up a little bit soon, a little bit shorter than I expected, because I've just got, I've seen a message flash up on my screen that apparently I am needed because Mini Drac is refusing to go to sleep without Drac there. So I'm going to have to maybe say another only 5 minutes or so, unfortunately, because it is quite late. And yeah, if Mini Drac is not sleeping now, there could be trouble in the morning if Mini Drac does not sleep soon. Incidentally, if anyone in the UK is interested, I have a 2-meter long Falklands War era remote control floating model of HMS Hermes that I need to get rid of. So if anyone wants it, please let me know, because it's taking up huge amounts of space in my garage and getting dusty. Ramal3866 says, do you think the TBD Devastator would have had worse performance than the Swordfish if you used the TBD for going after Bismarck? Yes, actually, because it was an all-metal monoplane, so some of the ammunition and fragments that punched holes in the Swordfish, and they went, oh, cool, the canvas has a hole in it, might have actually done a bit more damage to a Devastator. For April Fools, have you considered doing a charity appeal-style video on Royal Sovereign-Milwaukee? I.e. a Donkey Sanctuary-style appeal? No, but that's a very good idea. I actually have a slightly different idea for this upcoming April Fools, but that may very well be the 2027 one. Drop me an email with that. I want to shortlist that. W. Osterberg says, was I too late getting my alternate history question in this month? No, because we're quite a few behind with these live streams. I need to catch up. So yeah, if you put an alternate history question in this month, it's it'll be answered when we get to it. Yeah, the few of you pointing out the Royal Sovereign getting returned shenanigans. That's a whole video in and of itself. How old is the small one right now? What's it? It's December, so 1 year and 3/4 now. Yeah. Yeah, so I need to yeah, I need to look at just before I do anything else. Make a note to start putting together a video on Royal Sovereign and poor old Milwaukee in Soviet hands. There we go. Right, okay. At that point, I think I'm going to have to wrap this up and go down and sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star repeatedly until my voice stops working, because that seems to work with Mini Drac. And yeah. Thanks very much for coming, everybody. Sorry this one's only just over 3 hours. I shall try to do better next time. But see you all later at some point in the near future. Bye for now.